There is a woman who knew everything and could change nothing, not a goddess, not a warrior. A princess, someone whose only burden was clarity, whose gift became a curse the moment a god turned away in pride. She stood at the walls of a great city and spoke the truth into deaf ears, again and again, watching the future arrive exactly as she had warned. We follow the one who saw it all coming. Take a moment to subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely bring you peace. Now find your quiet. The torch is already burning. Troy rose from the plain of the Troad like something the earth had decided to push upward slowly over centuries, until a city stood where once there had been only wind and grass. From a distance, in the early morning light, the walls appeared pale as bone. Up close they were enormous, fitted stone, dry and ancient, stacked with such care that grass could not find a seam to root in. The city sat on its hill above the plain of Scamander, and the plain stretched flat and wide toward the sea, and the sea lay beyond that, grey or green or silver depending on the hour, depending on the season. This was Priam's city. His father Laomedon had built sections of those walls. His grandfather's memory was in the stone too, layered back and back into a history so old that even the priests had difficulty tracing where legend ended and something older began. Priam had expanded the palace on the high citadel until it contained corridors that took several minutes to walk end to end. 50 sons lived within its walls in their own chambers. Daughters too, and their husbands and their children. The palace of Troy held an entire world inside it. Hecuba was Priam's queen. She was a woman of Phrygia, daughter of King Demas, and she had come to Troy as a young bride and learned the city room by room, wall by wall, until she knew it as completely as she had once known her childhood home. By the time her later children were born, she was already a figure of considerable presence in the court. She moved through the palace corridors with a steadiness that younger women observed and tried quietly to imitate. Priam consulted her. He always had. This was a household built around 2 people who had chosen, somewhere in the long years of their marriage, to trust each other. Cassandra was born in the later years of their family, not the first of Hecuba's children, and not the last. She arrived alongside her twin Helenus in a single night of labour that Hecuba would later describe with a particular mixture of exhaustion and wonder. 2 children at once, each one completing something the other had begun. The midwives said it was a favourable sign. Priam accepted the news with the particular satisfaction of a man who had already welcomed many children into the world and found each one remarkable in its own way. The twins were carried through the palace halls the following morning, shown to the household, presented at the small household altar. Priam held each child briefly and with great care. Hecuba watched from her bed, still and quiet, with the expression of a woman who has just accomplished something large and is taking stock of it. Cassandra opened her eyes, they said later, with unusual directness. Most newborns squint against the light. Cassandra, in the account the nurses repeated for years afterward, simply looked. Troy in those years was a place of considerable wealth and reasonable peace. Priam had navigated the complex politics of the region with patience. He maintained alliances through marriage, through diplomacy, through gifts sent at appropriate moments to appropriate courts. The tribute that flowed through the Hellespont passed partly under Trojan influence, and this gave the city a financial ease that showed in its temples, in its markets, in the quality of the goods that arrived by ship from the east. The temples within Troy's walls were well maintained and frequently visited. Apollo had a significant presence in the city and in the surrounding region. His temple at Thymbraion, just outside the walls, drew both citizens and travellers. Apollo was understood in Troy as the far-shooter, the god of silver light and clear sight and music that carried over great distances. His worship required precision. His priests were careful men and women who understood that clarity was both a gift and a demand. Athena also had her place within Troy. Her temple stood on the citadel, not far from the palace itself, and her statue there was old. older than the current temple structure, older than the political arrangements that shape the city now. The citizens of Troy felt the goddess's presence as a kind of stone-cold certainty, reliable and vast. She did not love easily, they understood, but she was just. Her sanctuary was considered among the most inviolable spaces in the city. To take refuge at her image was to place oneself under a protection that even conquerors were expected to honor. Into this world, Cassandra and Helenus were born and began to grow. They were similar in appearance, as twins often are, and in early childhood they remained close in the particular way of children who have shared even the earliest months of existence. They played in the same corridors. They attended the same lessons. They appeared together at religious ceremonies, small and solemn in their good clothes. Standing a little apart from the older siblings who had long since learned where to stand and when to be quiet, Helenus was gentle-natured. Those who knew him well described a boy who listened carefully before speaking, who observed more than he announced. Cassandra was different. Not louder exactly, but more present somehow. She asked questions that her teachers occasionally found difficult to answer. She looked at things directly and persistently, long after other children had moved their attention to something else. The court of Priam received visitors regularly. Ambassadors, merchants, other kings passing through on their way to somewhere else. The great hall of the palace had seen banquets of considerable scale and ceremonies of considerable significance. Priam conducted these occasions with the ease of long practice. Hecuba sat beside him or nearby, and the children of the household appeared and withdrew according to the demands of each event. In this court, surrounded by ceremony and stone and the continuous traffic of a great city's life, Cassandra and Helenus moved through their early years as two children who had not yet discovered what was waiting for them. The temple stood open each morning. The priests burned their incense. The sea moved beyond the plain, always the same sea, always changing. And the city went about its business on the hill, confident in its walls, confident in its gods, confident in the particular permanence that all great cities believe they possess. Priam had given Troy 50 years of his life by this point. He knew the smell of the lower market at dawn, and the sound of the Scaean Gate opening each morning, the groan of its hinges, the brief pause before the ordinary sounds of the plain began. He was a man who loved his city with the specific and unromantic love of someone who has administered it, paid for it, negotiated on its behalf, watched it through drought and abundance, and all the ordinary crises that a city accumulates across decades. He did not yet know what was coming. None of them did, except in flickers and fragments that she could not yet name or understand, perhaps Cassandra. But she had not yet received the clarity that would make those fragments unbearable. She was still only a child, standing in the great courtyards of Priam's palace, looking out toward the plain with the unseeing attention of someone waiting, without knowing it, for something to arrive. The road to Thymbraeon was not long. It ran southwest from the Scaean Gate, across the plain, following the course of the Scamander for a short distance, before turning toward higher ground. The temple itself sat on a low rise above the plain, its stones pale in the morning light, its entrance facing east toward the river and the sea beyond. Priests walked that road daily. Travellers came from farther away, stopping at the temple before continuing into the city or after leaving it, making their petitions at the threshold before the world opened again into its ordinary distances. Cassandra had walked the road to Thymbraeon before, with her mother and with the older siblings who supervised the younger children on such occasions. She knew the texture of the path underfoot, the way the dust rose differently in summer, and in the cooler months, the particular quality of the air near the river before the road turned inland. She knew the temple's exterior, the carved frieze above the lintel, worn but still legible, the stone steps, each one worn slightly concave in its centre from the passage of many feet across many seasons. On this occasion she was perhaps 7 or 8 years old. Helenus walked beside her. The priest who accompanied them was a quiet man named Chryses, not the famous priest of that name who would appear in Troy's later years, but a different man entirely. Older, with careful hands and deliberate speech. He had been asked by one of the senior priests to bring the twins to the temple for the proper ceremonies that marked certain stages of a royal child's religious education. The palace sent its children to the temples in this way. It was expected. It was ordinary. What happened afterward was not ordinary. The ceremonies were not elaborate. There were offerings. There were prayers spoken aloud in the formal register used for addressing the god. Chryses recited the titles of Apollo in the correct order. The far-shooter, the silver-bowed, the god of clear sight and music, and the light that travels without obstacle over great distances. Cassandra listened with the focused attention that had always made her teachers slightly uneasy. Helenus stood beside her with his hands quiet at his sides and his eyes moving carefully around the interior of the temple. The interior of the temple at Thymbrae was cool even in warm weather. Its walls were thick. Its floor was smooth stone, slightly darker than the walls. At the far end stood Apollo's image, rendered in the older style, less naturalistic than more recent sculpture, but carrying in its stillness an authority that the more fluid, newer forms sometimes lacked. The god looked forward. His proportions were deliberate and exact. His face held the expression that all good images of Apollo held, clarity without warmth, attention without intimacy. The serpents were kept in the inner chamber to the left of the main sanctuary. They were sacred animals, cared for by a dedicated temple servant who fed them and cleaned their enclosure and moved among them with the comfort of long familiarity. They were not large serpents. Not frightening ones, or not meant to be frightening. They were smooth and pale, the colour of old ivory in certain lights. They moved slowly and without apparent purpose, which is to say, they moved in exactly the way that sacred things move, with the patience that suggests they have no concern with time at all. Chryses brought the children to see them as part of the temple education. He explained their significance in measured tones. These animals were sacred to the god. Their care was a form of worship. Their presence in the temple was very old, older than the current building, older than most records. He did not suggest that anything unusual would occur. Cassandra looked at the serpents for a long time without speaking. Helenus watched them too, though more cautiously, stepping back slightly from the low stone enclosure that separated the animals from the room. The temple servant, an old man with the slow movements of someone who has been in the same place for many years, nodded at the children with the mild approval of a person whose work is rarely witnessed by anyone of interest. What happened next, those who recalled it later would describe in different ways. The priest Chryses, who was present, said only that the children remained in the inner chamber longer than he had anticipated, and that when he returned from a brief errand he found both of them asleep on the cool stone floor beside the enclosure, and the serpents moving quietly beside them. He described no alarm in his account of this. He said the children had simply been tired, as children often become tired in warm, quiet rooms in the middle of the day. The temple servant recalled differently. He said the serpents had moved out of the enclosure. He could not explain how this had occurred, since the enclosure was designed precisely to prevent such movement. He said they had moved along the floor in their slow and deliberate way, and that they had come to rest beside the sleeping twins, and that one of them had moved close to Cassandra's head and another close to Helenus's, and that both serpents had rested there quietly for some time. He said their tongues moved against the children's ears. Small, precise movements, unhurried, as if completing a task they had always known was required of them. He did not wake the children. He did not disturb the serpents. He stood in the doorway of the inner chamber and watched, and he said later that he felt no fear. Only the specific stillness of someone present at something they understand. They are not meant to interrupt. When Cassandra woke, she lay still for a moment. Her eyes were open. The stone floor was cool against her cheek. The air in the inner chamber smelled of incense and something older, something animal and particular that she could not name. She heard the sound of the river distantly through the thick walls. She heard Helenus breathing beside her. She heard, very faintly, as if from an extraordinary distance, what she would later try to describe as music, though she said it was not quite music. It was more like the sound that precedes music. The moment before a note is struck, when the instrument is ready and the air around it is already beginning to change. She sat up. The serpents had returned to their enclosure, or perhaps she only imagined them elsewhere. The enclosure sat as it always sat. The pale forms within it moved in their slow, habitual way. Helenus was waking beside her. He sat up more slowly, rubbing his eyes with the ordinary gesture of a child returning from sleep. He looked at her, and she looked at him. She could not say, later, what she had expected to see in his face. Something different, perhaps, but he looked like himself. Her brother, his familiar expression careful and quiet, now carrying a certain new carefulness, as if he had heard something very far away and was still listening. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm. He covered it with his own hand. They sat together on the cool floor without speaking, while Chrysis returned to the doorway and told them gently that it was time to begin the walk back to the city. The plain was bright when they emerged from the temple. The sea was visible at the horizon, pale and flat under the afternoon light. The road stretched ahead of them, dusty and ordinary. The city sat on its hill above the plain, its pale walls catching the sun, its gates open, its flags moving slightly in the wind from the coast. Cassandra walked the path she knew, the same dust, the same stones, the worn step at the gate's threshold as she passed beneath it. But the sounds of the city reached her differently now, voices she could not see around corners. A child crying somewhere below the citadel before she could have heard it. The distant movement of a cart on a street that ran parallel but not adjacent to the one she walked. She received these sounds not with alarm but with a confused patience, the way a person receives new information they have not yet found a frame to hold. Helenus walked quietly beside her. He did not speak of what he had heard. She did not ask. They passed through the Scaean Gate and entered the city, and the city received them as it always had, loud and warm and smelling of bread and dust, and the particular salt carried inland from the sea, and nothing in it knew yet that two of the children passing through its streets had been changed. In some small and permanent way, in a pale room among pale serpents, while an afternoon moved without ceremony toward its close. Days passed after the visit to the temple. Cassandra returned to the palace, to the room she knew, to the voices of her sisters, and the sound of Priam's court moving through its ordinary hours. She helped with the small tasks assigned to daughters of the royal household. She sat at meals. She slept in her usual bed. She was, to all appearances, the same child who had left for Thymbraon several mornings before. But the hearing did not leave her. It settled, instead, into a permanent feature of her days, the way a new season settles in, gradual, unremarkable from one hour to the next, and then simply present, as if it had always been so. She heard things before they happened. Not loudly, not with clarity, more the way a scent precedes its source, arriving without announcement and belonging, apparently, to no one. Helenus had his own version of this. She could see it in him, the slight pause before he answered a question, as if the answer had arrived a moment before the question was asked. He was quieter than he had been before the temple. Not unhappy, only more inward. More careful with words, as if he had begun to understand that some words, once spoken, could not be recalled. They rarely discussed what had happened in the inner chamber. Not because it was forbidden or frightening, but because the experience resisted language. When Cassandra tried to describe what she heard, the descriptions became thin and approximate, stripped of the quality that made the hearing real. She tried once, sitting with Helenus on the broad steps outside their shared rooms, in the late afternoon when the court was quiet. She said, It is like knowing the shape of a thing before you can see it. Helenus considered this for a while. He said, "It is like remembering something that has not yet occurred." They sat with both descriptions, and neither felt complete, and after a while they stopped trying to complete them. What they found, instead, was a way of being together that did not require completion. A glance across a room, a pause in conversation that both recognized, a shared understanding of certain silences that others in the palace moved through without noticing. This was its own form of intimacy, not built from explanation, but from parallel experience carried in two separate bodies that had lain on the same cool floor in the same pale room and woken changed in the same direction. It was perhaps 3 months after the visit to Thymbraon when Cassandra became aware of a presence that had not been present before. She was in the sanctuary of Apollo within the palace complex. A smaller temple than Thymbraon, but older in its fittings, the offerings arranged by her mother's women in the careful way of long habit. She had come alone, which was not unusual. She had always found the sanctuary quieter than the rest of the palace. The sound of the court did not penetrate its thick walls. She was sitting on the low bench at the far end of the sanctuary when she became aware that the light had changed. It was not the light of afternoon, which was warm and carried dust. This was something else. Steadier, cooler in one sense and warmer in another, both at once, the way that paradox sometimes resolves into a third thing that is neither of its parts. She did not feel afraid. She felt, instead, a particular alertness. The alertness of someone who has been waiting for something without knowing it, and who recognizes its arrival before understanding what it is. He did not appear as she might have imagined, not as the ancient carved image in the temple at Thymbraon, formal and still, cut from stone into perfect proportions. He was present in the room with her the way a certainty is present, occupying no specific location, and yet undeniably there, and she understood, without being told, who she was in the presence of. She thought afterward that she had expected something overwhelming, something that would press her down or strip language from her entirely. But what she felt was almost conversational, a quality of attention being directed at her. A genuine attention, patient and unhurried, the way light pools in a courtyard in the morning before anyone has entered it. He did not speak in words she heard with her ears. She understood him the way she understood the sounds that had come to her since the temple. Prior to language, before the note was struck, he asked whether she wished to know more fully what had begun in her. She was 7 or 8 years old. She had heard voices around corners and understood things before they were spoken, and felt the world arranged ahead of her in directions she could not quite perceive. She had sat on steps with her brother and found that language could not hold it. She wanted to understand what she was carrying. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very small in the cool room. Not afraid, only sincere. His attention remained on her. It was not warm in the way her mother's attention was warm. It was something else, precise. Interested, the way a physician might attend to something rare and worth understanding. What he gave her then was not an event. It was more like a deepening. The gift she had carried since the temple did not change in character. It remained the same strange hearing, the same early knowledge. But it became fuller, more complete, the way a room becomes more visible as the eye adjusts. She sat with it for a while. The light continued, steady. She could feel his presence still, and she felt toward it what a very young person sometimes feels toward something much larger than themselves, not worship exactly, but recognition. The sense of standing near something that has existed long before you and will continue long after. She thought, he is very old. She thought, he is interested in me. Both of these thoughts arrived without vanity. They were simply observations, the way she might observe the color of the sky or the sound of the river. She held them carefully. He remained in the sanctuary a little longer. She did not speak again. She did not have words for what she might have said. She sat in the particular stillness of someone who has received something and has not yet begun to understand its full cost. When the light returned to ordinary afternoon light, she stayed on the bench for some time. She did not go immediately to find Helenus. She thought she should, but she sat instead and let the sanctuary come back to itself around her, the familiar smell of old offerings, the low sounds of the palace, the dust settling in the ordinary light. She would go to him eventually. She would sit beside him on the palace steps, and she would try to find words for what had occurred, and the words would again be approximate and thin, but Helenus would receive them carefully and offer his own careful observations in return, and this would be enough. Not because words were sufficient, but because her brother was the person who understood best that words were not sufficient, and that some things were shared anyway, across the silence that language could not cross. She descended the steps of the sanctuary slowly. The stone under her feet was warm from the afternoon. The courtyard beyond was bright. She could hear, around the far corner of the palace wall, a conversation between two servants that had not yet begun. She walked across the courtyard, and the servants' voices arrived just as she had heard them. The same words, the same pause in the middle where one of them stopped to adjust something in her arms. The same small laugh at the end. Cassandra passed them without stopping. They did not look up. She found Helenus where she expected to find him, on the broad steps outside their shared rooms. His back against the warm stone, a piece of knotted cord in his hands that he was not really looking at. He glanced at her when she sat down. He did not ask where she had been. They sat for a while in the ordinary late afternoon noise of the palace. Somewhere above them, a window covering moved in the breeze. A goat sounded from the far yard. The light on the stone of the steps was going amber, the way it did before it went gold, and then before it went out. Cassandra thought about the servants' voices. She thought about how clearly she had heard them before they happened, not as a blur or a suggestion, the way things had arrived before Thymbraon. This was clean and whole, like hearing a phrase of music recalled perfectly, note by note, ahead of the instrument being played. She had not found this frightening. She noticed that. She stored the observation carefully, the way she stored other things she was not yet sure how to use. Helenus set the knotted cord down on the step between them. He said, "It is fuller now." "Is it not?" Not a question. She looked at him. He was watching the far wall of the courtyard, where the light was settling into the stone. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He picked up the cord again. She understood that he had felt it too, the deepening, though not in the same form. His gift moved differently than hers. Where hers arrived in sounds and the shape of events assembled ahead of time, his arrived in other ways she did not entirely have language for. He had explained it to her once, imperfectly. Hers was like hearing. His was more like reading, he had said. Marks on a surface that resolved into meaning if you held them at the right angle. She had understood what he meant, even though the description was also approximate. That evening, she sat in the room where her mother sometimes held the younger children before sleep. Hecuba was not there. The room was quiet. A small clay lamp burned on the ledge near the far wall. Cassandra was not supposed to sit near an unattended flame, but the nurse had stepped out, and she was 7 or perhaps 8 years old, and she understood already that certain rules existed for children, and that she was becoming something else. Though she could not have named what, she looked at the flame. It moved with the ordinary movement of a flame in a room with still air, small tilts, a slight lean. It was not doing anything unusual. What was unusual was what she began to see inside it. Not images exactly. More, the way a thought arrives before it is a thought, the ghost of its shape, the implication of it. She did not see a face in the flame. She saw something like the possibility of a face, dark-haired and easy in itself, carrying a self-satisfaction that she would later learn to recognize as the expression of a man who believes the world has arranged itself for him. She did not know who it was. She was 7 or 8 years old. She had no name for the sensation, and she looked away from the flame for a moment, then back. The sensation came again, different now. A suggestion of water, a long distance covered. Something bright moving across water in the dark, many bright things, and her chest tightened briefly in a way she could not account for. She looked at her hands in her lap, then she looked back at the flame. What came next was quieter, not frightening. Quieter in the way that some things are when they are very large, too large for alarm, the alarm belonging to a smaller scale. She did not see walls collapsing. She did not see fire on anything other than the small clay lamp before her, but she felt the direction of something. A direction, the way a river has a direction, pulling toward a conclusion that is not visible from where you are standing, but that the water already knows. She did not understand that it was her city she was feeling. She was too young to assemble the full shape of it. What she held, sitting beside the lamp while the nurse was out of the room, was something fragmentary and incomplete, a piece without its context. But the piece was real, and her body registered it as real, the faint tightening in her chest that was not fear but something older than fear, the way the body knows a thing before the mind is willing to receive it. Hecuba had dreamed before he was born, before Paris, before any of them knew what he would be called or what he would bring with him. Cassandra had not been alive for that dream, of course. She would not hear about it for some years still. But she felt, beside the lamp, the particular texture of that old dreaming, a mother seeing fire spread from something she loved, unable to stop it, unable to turn away. She did not know she was feeling the echo of her mother's dream. She only knew that the sensation was not hers alone, that other hands had held this particular weight before her. The nurse returned. Cassandra looked up. The nurse said something about the oil in the lamp and adjusted the wick. The flame bent and recovered. Cassandra did not mention what she had seen, or almost seen, in the fire. She did not have words for it that would have meant what she meant. She said that she was tired, which was true, and she went to her bed and lay in the warm dark and listened to the palace settle around her, the sounds of preparation for the evening meal, a door somewhere being closed. The particular tone of her father's voice from far away, not making out the words, only recognizing the voice itself, she thought about the shape she had felt beside the lamp. The direction of it. She lay still and let the feeling settle, the way sediment settles in water when the water stops being disturbed. It did not resolve into anything clearer. It only lay there, held inside her without requiring anything of her yet. A weight that was not yet a weight. An arrival she had no name for. She heard, before she slept, a bird on the outer wall of the palace. She heard it settle. She heard the small dry sound of its feet on the stone. Then she heard it lift away. She had heard it lift before it moved. Years later, many years, though she could not always place which year in the order of the others, she would remember that bird, the way the hearing of it came first. The way the fact of it arrived before the fact was made. She held that memory carefully, the way one holds something that has no outer surface to grip. Apollo did not announce the curse loudly. That was what she remembered most. When she remembered it at all, no thunder. No formal pronouncement made in the presence of the other gods. He simply changed the nature of the gift he had already given, and the change was quiet in the way that permanent things are quiet. Like a door that closes without a sound, and is then locked from outside. She had been standing in the upper corridor of the temple at Thymbraon. She could still feel the quality of the air there, cool against her forearms, carrying the faint residue of incense from the morning offerings. Light came in at an oblique angle from the high window on the western wall. It lay across the stone floor in a long, pale rectangle. Apollo had stood at the end of the corridor. She had told him that day she could not reconstruct the exact words. Only the feeling of them, that she would not come to him, that what had been offered between them was not something she could accept. She had kept her voice level because that was what she had available, Her hands were still at her sides. He had listened. She remembered that. He had not interrupted her. He had stood very still and listened with his full attention, and she had understood while she was speaking that the listening itself was not comfort, but something else, the attention of a being making certain he had heard correctly before he acted. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You will still see." She waited. He said, "But no one will believe what you say you have seen." She stood with that. Tried to find its edges. He was gone before she had finished trying. She found Helenus in the courtyard below the temple. He was sitting on the low wall that separated the herb garden from the paved area where the priests walked in the late afternoon. His feet did not quite reach the ground. He was looking at something in his hands, a small piece of flattened clay that one of the priest's children had left there, pressed with a blunt edge into patterns that resolved. If you tilted it into the rough shape of a horse. She sat beside him. She did not speak immediately. Around them the sounds of the temple complex continued, a water vessel being moved, a low exchange of voices somewhere above. The distant rhythm of someone at a repetitive task on the far side of the courtyard wall. Then she told him. Not everything. She told him the structure of it. That Apollo had spoken. That the gift was still present, but had been altered. That the alteration was specific, she would see and speak, and the people she spoke to would hear the sound she made and not receive the meaning. Helenus turned the piece of clay over in his hands. He did not look at her. She watched him process it, not quickly. Helenus was never quick with a feeling that mattered, the way his shoulders adjusted. A slight settling, something moving across his face that was not grief exactly, but was in the vicinity of grief. He said, "Does it change what you see?" She considered that. He had asked the right question. She said, "No, what I see is the same. Only what happens to it afterward is different." He turned the clay piece over again. Then he set it on the wall between them. She looked at the shape pressed into it. A rough horse, or the suggestion of one made by a child's hand with a blunt tool, nothing portentous. Only a child's passing effort. Helenus said, "Then you still have it." She understood what he meant. He meant the seeing itself, the clean arrival of it, the way it came to her complete before anything else. He meant that the gift had not been removed, only made private, made permanent and private at the same time. Like something sealed into stone, still present, unchanged inside, but the surface closed over it. She said yes. He nodded. A small nod, the kind between people who have already agreed on the essential. Hecuba was harder, not because her mother was unkind, because she was attentive in the way that mothers are who have learned, through the bearing of many children, to read a face before the face intends to speak. Hecuba saw Cassandra that evening across the table at the family meal and said nothing in the moment. She waited. She was practiced at waiting. Later, when the younger children had been gathered away by the nurses, Hecuba found Cassandra in the long corridor near the east wing. She put her hand on Cassandra's arm and looked at her and said, "What has happened?" Not a question. The form of a question without the asking in it. Cassandra tried. She told her mother that Apollo had spoken to her, and that the terms of what had passed between them in the temple had changed. She said she had refused something, and that there were consequences to the refusal. Hecuba listened carefully. Her face did not change in the way a frightened person's face changes. It grew more attentive, which was a different thing. Then she said, "He will not harm you." Cassandra said, "It is not that kind of harm." She watched her mother try to understand. The trying was visible, a real effort, a real reaching toward what her daughter was holding, and then the moment when it did not arrive. When what Cassandra was describing remained just beyond the place where Hecuba's comprehension could settle, her mother said, "You are tired. You have been at the temple all day, and you are tired, and the god has impressed upon you something large. We will speak again in the morning." Her mother believed she was frightened and overwhelmed. That was the only available shape the information could take inside Hecuba's mind, and so it took that shape, and the actual thing that had happened remained outside it. Cassandra said yes. Perhaps in the morning. She watched Hecuba move away down the corridor. The lamp her mother held made her shadow long on the wall behind her, stretching back toward Cassandra and then shortening again as she turned the corner. That was the first time. The first time she had tried to say a true thing and felt the truth itself arrive intact at her lips and then fail, not from lack of words, but from some alteration in how the words were received. Like sound moving through water, still sound. Still the same sound, but the medium changed. Helenus came to her room before the palace was fully dark. He sat with her without speaking for a while. That was the thing about Helenus. He understood the value of sitting without requiring anything to be resolved. She had always known this about him and was grateful for it now in a way that she had not been grateful for it before, because now she understood it might become necessary. He had brought the piece of clay with him, the child's pressed horse, rough and unpretentious. He set it on the ledge by her sleeping mat without explanation. She looked at it. He said after a while, "I will still listen." She said, "I know." He said, "Even if I cannot always," and he stopped. He did not finish the thought, because finishing it would have required him to say aloud that he might not fully believe what she told him. And he was not ready to say that, and she did not need him to. She knew it already. She knew it the way she had known the bird would lift before it lifted. She said, "I know that too." He stayed until she slept. When she woke in the small hours, he was gone. The clay horse remained on the ledge. In the faint light coming through the high window, its rough shape looked almost like something else. A figure. A person mid-step, going somewhere. She looked at it until the light shifted, and it became a horse again. The morning came without ceremony, a thin light through the high window. The sounds of the palace resuming, water, footsteps, the distant clatter of the kitchens beginning their work. Cassandra lay still for a while and looked at the clay horse on the ledge. She had known it first as a small thing. Insignificant. A child's pressed mark in unbaked clay, left on a temple step and carried here by her brother's careful hands. But she had spent the small hours of the night watching it hold its shape in the dark, and now it seemed to her that it meant something she had not yet fully read, not a prophecy. Only a coincidence with a feeling attached. She set it aside. There were other things to think about. It is necessary here to speak about Paris. Not as she knew him later, not as the man who returned from Sparta with his prize and set in motion everything she had already seen, but as a thread in the loom before the weaving began, a strand that had been placed there long before anyone recognized what pattern it would join. Paris had not grown up in the palace. That fact alone carried its own weight. Hecuba had dreamed before his birth. This Cassandra had heard from Hecuba herself, in the way that mothers sometimes speak of such things to their daughters, not as warning, but as wonder. A dream of fire, of a torch that set the city blazing. Hecuba had gone to the seers, and the seers had said, "The child, if born, will be Troy's destruction." And Priam, faced with that verdict, had sent the infant away to Mount Ida, to the herdsmen on the slopes, with instructions that the thing be done. But it had not been done. The shepherd entrusted with the task had found himself unable. He had left the child in the hills and told himself the exposure would accomplish what he could not. And the child had lived. The child had been found. Raised among herdsmen on Ida's green lower slopes, growing into a man who tended cattle and carved his name into no stone, he was called Paris, or Alexander. Both names travelled with him for different reasons, and he used whichever one the moment required. Cassandra had known he was alive before the palace knew. She had seen it in the way she saw most things, not as an image exactly, but as a certainty arriving before its occasion. A brother on a hillside, a face she recognized before it appeared. She had said nothing, because she had learned quickly that saying nothing preserved the peace, and because she was still young enough then to hope that the thing seen might not become the thing that happened. The judgment on Mount Ida came to her in fragments. She had not been present. No one from the palace had, but the gods had moved through it, and the gods leave traces in the air the way weather does, a pressure change, a quality of stillness before a shift. She had felt that shift, and afterward the pieces arrived in her mind as if carried by slow water, each one separate, each one accurate. 3 goddesses descending from Olympus to a herdsman's hillside. Hera, Athena, Aphrodite, each wearing her own version of beauty, each carrying an intention she called impartial. The golden apple. Eris had thrown it as a joke, or something worse than a joke, an invitation to a quarrel that could not end well regardless of which answer was chosen. The apple rolled. The 3 goddesses looked at each other. Someone had to judge. Paris stood among his cattle and looked up. Cassandra, years later, still felt the absurdity of that moment, a herdsman from Ida chosen to adjudicate between 3 divine wills. He had been chosen precisely because he had no standing, because he could be blamed afterward, and the blame would be small enough to absorb without disturbing the cosmic order. He had listened to each goddess speak. Hera offered dominion, kingdoms, power that extends until the edges of the map and then beyond them. The kind of authority that requires armies and administrators and the constant expenditure of lesser men's loyalty. Athena offered wisdom and skill in war, a mind that sees strategy before it is needed, the gift of prevailing without always requiring more men than your enemy has. Aphrodite offered the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris had not deliberated long. That was the mechanism. That was the hinge on which everything turned. Later, when Cassandra tried to explain to anyone what she had seen, what she had already known when Paris returned from Sparta with Helen standing at his side, the failure of transmission was most complete at exactly this point. Because what she was describing was not merely a prediction about war. It was an account of cause, of how a divine dispute had been routed through a mortal man's desire, and how that routing had made the destruction of Troy not a contingency but a consequence, already decided, already sealed. The word she wanted was not danger. It was completion. The thing was complete already. Only the unfolding remained. No one could receive that. Not Priam, who heard danger and thought, we can negotiate. Not Hector, who heard war and thought, we can fight. Not Hecuba, who heard prophecy and thought, the seer is overwrought. She was not overwrought. She was simply describing a finished thing in a language that treated it as still open. The gods themselves bore examination here. Aphrodite had made a promise to Paris on Mount Ida, and the gods do not make promises casually. A promise from a goddess is a commitment that precedes all lesser agreements. When Aphrodite said, "the most beautiful woman in the world," she meant it as a fixed point. A thing that would occur, not could occur. Would. That meant Helen was not a choice. Paris made freely when he arrived at Sparta and sat at Menelaus's table. Helen was already his in the divine accounting. He was only performing the act that the promise required him to perform. Helen herself knew nothing of the apple, nothing of the hillside, the 3 goddesses, the judgment. She had been living her life, her complicated, already storied life, in Sparta with Menelaus. Going about her days, when the mechanism Aphrodite set in motion arrived at her door in the form of a Trojan prince who looked at her across a banquet hall and felt what he had been arranged to feel. Cassandra pitied them both. She pitied Paris for the shape his choice had been pressed into before he made it. She pitied Helen for being the substance of a promise made about her without her knowledge or consent. She had said this to Helenus once. He had looked at her with the careful attention he always gave her statements, and then he had said, "Yes." She understood from that single word that he had arrived at something similar through his own quieter channel. The name Aphrodite carried its own complexity. The gods act from their natures, not from malice. That was the thing Cassandra had understood early. Aphrodite had not intended to destroy Troy. She had only fulfilled her promise, which was what a goddess of her nature must do. The destruction of Troy was a consequence, not a purpose. But consequences and purposes produce the same rubble. Hera and Athena, who had lost the judgment on Ida, turned toward the Greeks. Their support for the Greek cause was equally uncomplicated, not cruelty, only the working out of a sleight that demanded working out through the only instruments available, which were mortal armies. That was the world Cassandra had been given the sight to see clearly. A world where divine decisions moved through human lives with perfect indifference to the particular lives they moved through, not because the gods were evil, because they were vast, and vastness does not concern itself with the small complete lives it reshapes without intending to. She lay in the early morning light and turned this over. The clay horse was still on the ledge. Outside, the palace gathered its daytime sounds around itself. Someone below was calling a name. A door swung somewhere, its hinge catching, the sound carrying up through stone. Paris was still on Ida, still tending his cattle. Not yet summoned back to Troy, not yet dispatched westward. Still existing for a little longer in the uncomplicated life the hillside had given him. She knew exactly how much longer. The morning did not hurry itself. It settled into the room the way all mornings did, gradually, through the high window, across stone, across the ledge where the clay horse stood. Cassandra watched the light change. She had done this many times. She would do it a finite number more. She rose eventually, moved to the window. Below, the palace was arranging its daily business. A woman crossed the courtyard carrying a jar, her steps unhurried, her shadow preceding her on the paving stones. Ordinary motion, the kind that filled a life without marking it. Helen arrived at the Scaean Gate on a morning with no particular quality to distinguish it. The sky was pale. A wind came off the water, mild and without direction. Cassandra was among the people gathered there, not by plan, simply by the fact that she had been walking, and the gate was where her walking had taken her. The procession came in from the road. Paris first, changed by his westward months, something in the set of his shoulders, a new ease, the posture of a man who had gotten what he reached for. Then the wagons. Then her. Helen descended without ceremony. She had a way of moving that did not perform itself. She simply moved, and the watching organized itself around her without her asking it to. Cassandra stood still. She had known what Helen would look like. Certainty had carried that information for a long time, arriving with all its other arrivals, but knowing and seeing occupied different rooms in the body. The knowing lived somewhere behind the eyes. The seeing happened in the chest. Helen was not what the word beautiful usually meant. She was not decoration. She was clarity, the kind that makes everything near it look slightly less resolved. Cassandra understood in that moment why Aphrodite had named her specifically, not because she was rare, because she was exact. She was the only answer to the question the goddess had posed. They did not speak at the gate. The first time they did speak, it was several days later. Cassandra does not now remember exactly how it happened. A corridor, a wrong turn, the particular hour of mid-afternoon when the palace holds its breath between meals and obligations. Helen was standing near a window. She had been looking out. She turned when Cassandra entered. She did not look startled. She looked at Cassandra with a steadiness that was unusual. Most people, when they looked at Cassandra, arranged their faces into something careful. Helen's face arranged nothing. It simply looked. Cassandra said, "You did not ask for this." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No," and did not say it with complaint or bitterness or the exhausted patience of someone repeating something they have said many times. She said it as information. Plainly, the way a person names a fact they have finished arguing with. What Cassandra had not expected was the quality of Helen's attention. She had prepared, without knowing she was preparing, for distance, for the particular remove of a woman whose beauty had always been the subject of conversations she was not quite included in. That was what she had seen in the knowing, the abstract shape of Helen, the woman at the centre of a dispute that did not consult her. But Helen listened. She listened the way Hellenists listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually following the words to where they led. Cassandra said, "Do you know why you are here?" Helen said, "I know the story of a golden apple. A shepherd on a hillside, 3 goddesses, and a question put to someone who should not have been asked to answer it." Cassandra looked at her, said, "You know." Helen said, "I learned it, eventually, from a priestess at a temple in Sparta before all this. She told me there were things arranged about my life before my birth. I did not know then what she meant. I know now." That conversation. Cassandra returns to it. It was not long. Maybe the length of a particular light as it crossed from one wall to another, but it had the density of something longer. She said to Helen, "I am sorry for what is coming." Helen said, "Will it be very bad?" Cassandra said, "Yes." Helen looked at her without flinching. Said, "You see it?" Cassandra said, "I have seen it for a long time." Helen was quiet. Then she said, "Does seeing it make it harder or easier to carry?" That question. Cassandra had not been asked that before. Not by anyone. Priam asked what she had seen. Hecuba asked whether she was certain. Helenus, in his careful way, asked what channel the certainty came through. No one had asked whether knowing changed the weight. She said, harder. To know without being able to make the knowing useful. There is a particular shape to that. Helen said, "Yes, I think I understand that." Knowing without power to change what the knowing is about. They understood each other across a significant distance. Helen, who had carried her beauty through her whole life as a thing that happened to others more than to herself. Cassandra, who had carried sight through her whole life as a thing that happened to her and could be taken nowhere. Different burdens with a similar grain. It was not friendship exactly. There was not enough time for friendship. Troy would not give them enough time for friendship, but it was recognition. The feeling of looking at another person and seeing that they also know what it is to hold something that cannot be put down and cannot be made useful, only endured. Later. Cassandra thought Aphrodite had named her and sent Paris to retrieve her, and no one had asked Helen. The gods had routed a divine dispute through her face, her person, her life, and she had lived on the other side of all of it, carrying it with a steadiness that was not resignation. Something else. Something that required more than resignation to arrive at. She thought of what Helenus had said once, about how sorrow, when it cannot be refused, sometimes becomes a kind of clarity. He had meant it about their gift. Cassandra thought he had been describing Helen too, without knowing her. The clay horse was still on the ledge when she came back to her room that afternoon. She passed it without stopping. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Someone bargaining in the lower street. A child's voice, high and brief. The birds that nested near the gate were audible even here, their ordinary noise threading through the stones. Helen was settling into the palace. Paris was showing her Troy with the enthusiasm of a man who has brought a gift home and wants the recipient to understand how far he went to find it. Cassandra stood at her window. The water was visible from there, on certain clear days, the line of it at the horizon. This was a clear day. She looked at the water for a long time. Thought of ships, thought of Helen standing at a Spartan window that would have had a similar view. Thought of how a woman could look at the same sea from 2 different shores and be watching entirely different things approach. The birds near the gate fell quiet for a moment, then resumed. The summons came before the light changed. A servant at her door, soft-voiced, formal. The council was gathering in Priam's hall. Cassandra's presence had been requested. She did not move immediately. She stood another moment at the window, looking at the horizon where the sea was still visible, still pale, still holding the suggestion of what it carried toward them. Then she turned from it and went. Priam's hall in the late afternoon had a particular quality of accumulated warmth. The stones held the day's heat. The columns cast long shadows across the floor. The men who gathered there were the men who had always gathered there, elders, counsellors, her brothers. Her father at the centre of it all, with the calm authority he wore, the way he wore his robes, as if it had always fit him. Hector was there. She found him with her eyes first, before anyone else. He stood slightly apart from the others, arms folded, listening to something an elder was saying with the expression of a man already thinking about the practical weight of a decision before the decision had been named. Paris was there. He looked different inside the hall than he had looked at the gate. At the gate there had been sunlight, movement, the largeness of the courtyard to disperse his presence. Inside, in the close warmth of the hall, the change in him was easier to read. He had the ease of a man who has done something he is not uncertain about. Cassandra took her place at the edge of the room. No one looked up when she entered. The question before the council was simple enough in its asking, whether to keep Helen or restore her to Menelaus and avert whatever response her absence might provoke. An elder spoke first. He named the diplomatic argument. Menelaus had been a guest in Troy before. The obligations of hospitality ran in both directions. A negotiated return was possible, could be arranged with ceremony, could be framed as generosity rather than submission. Another spoke against it. To return her now would be to admit a wrong. Better to stand on the claim Paris had brought her home with, a claim with Aphrodite's name behind it. To send her back would be to insult a goddess. Paris spoke. He spoke the way he had learned to speak since his time among the Spartans, with a fluency that moved around the edges of the point. He spoke of Helen's willingness. He spoke of what had passed between them before the voyage. He did not speak of the Greek ships that would come. Cassandra listened to all of it. She stood at the edge and let the words pass through the room and waited. When Priam turned to her, she understood he was turning to her the way a man turns to a difficult piece of information he has been putting off. Not with hostility, with something more like the weariness of a man who loves his daughter and also loves the version of the world in which he is simply wrong. He said, "Cassandra, you have thoughts." She stepped forward. The floor was smooth under her feet, worn by years of the same gathering, the same slow wearing down of stone. She said, "The Greek ships will come. This is not uncertain. Menelaus will not absorb this. There is a man called Agamemnon, his brother, who commands more men than Troy has seen in a generation. They will come with that force. They will arrive on the plain below these walls, and they will not leave quickly." The room did not become loud. It did not erupt. It did the quieter thing, which was to slightly reconfigure itself around the words, finding the angle from which they could be set aside. Hector looked at her. His expression was careful. She knew his expression. He was the one who did not dismiss her the way the others did. He simply placed her words in a category of things that could not be acted on without evidence that had not yet arrived. She continued. She said the names she had seen. She said how long the siege would last. She said what the end of it would look like. She said the words plainly, without drama, in the same tone she had used with Helen. As information. As things she had finished arguing with inside herself long before she had to argue them here. Priam was quiet when she finished. He was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then he said, "We cannot return her on the basis of a fear." Hector came to her afterward. In the corridor outside the hall, while the others were still dispersing, he walked beside her for a few steps without speaking. Then he said, "I heard you." She said, "I know." He said, If the ships come, we will meet them. Troy's walls have held before. She looked at him. She did not argue with this. It was true that Troy's walls had held before. It was also true of every wall that had ever fallen. It had held before, it didn't. She did not say this. She said, "I know you heard me, Hector. I also know that hearing is not the same as being able to change what comes next." He was quiet. Then he said quietly, without anger, "What would you have us do? Send her back in chains? Tell Paris that the gods are wrong. Concede before a Greek fleet that has not yet left its harbour." She said yes. He looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite love and not quite the opposite of either. He said, "That is not possible." She said, "No, it is not." They stood in the corridor a moment longer. The light from a torch on the wall moved between them, the small sacred fire of it bending in a draught she could not locate. Then Hector put his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture without speech, and turned back toward the hall. She walked back to her room through corridors that were already quieting. The palace settling into evening, its familiar sounds, the particular creak of certain stones, a voice from a lower floor, the distant thread of the sea wind finding the gaps in the walls. The clay horse was where she had left it, on the ledge. Still, she did not pick it up. She sat on the edge of her sleeping mat and looked at it from across the room. The council had heard her. That much was true. They had heard her the way people heard her, completely, attentively, and without any capacity to use what they heard. The curse did not make them deaf. It made the hearing useless. She had understood this for years. She understood it again tonight, freshly, with the particular fresh quality that understanding something you already know can sometimes have. Troy's fate had been a matter for debate today. Tomorrow it would no longer be a matter for debate. The decision had been made, not dramatically, not with anyone raising their voice, but in the ordinary way that irreversible things are decided, by choosing to wait for evidence that would arrive too late to matter. Outside her window, the sea was no longer visible. The light had gone. The horizon had dissolved into the evening, taking its suggestion of sails with it. For now, only for now, she lay down. The city below continued its sounds. A cart on the lower street, a gate closing somewhere, the birds near the Scaean Gate settling into their ordinary nighttime quiet. She lay still and let the sounds come through the stone walls and did not try to stop any of it. The knowing was already there. It had always already been there. She had said it plainly in her father's hall, with the men who would decide Troy's future standing in the same warm air. The small clay horse on the ledge caught the last available light from the open window, a faint gleam along one curved flank. Then that too faded, and it was simply dark, and the city kept its ordinary sounds, and Cassandra closed her eyes on a Troy that had already chosen. The war came as she had said it would, not in the season immediately following. There were months first, months of ordinary Troy, of markets and prayers, and the small adjustments a city makes when it has decided to live with a decision. The Scaean Gate opened each morning. The priests of Apollo performed their rites at the appointed hours. The sea remained pale and empty for longer than she had expected, long enough that she sometimes caught herself checking it with something close to doubt, not doubt of the vision, doubt of the timing. Then the ships appeared. She was standing on the wall above the lower city when the first dark shapes resolved out of the morning haze. One. Then a cluster. Then more than she could hold individually with her eyes, so that she stopped counting and simply looked at the total of them. The sheer accumulated fact of it spreading across the water below the plain. She did not call out. There was no one beside her who needed to hear it from her. They would see it themselves, and they did, and the word moved through Troy's streets with a speed that required no prophecy to explain. The siege arranged itself around the city. This is the word she returned to often in those early years. Arranged. Not fell, not struck. It arranged itself with a kind of unhurried deliberateness, the Greek encampment spreading along the shore. The ships pulled up onto the beach, the cook fires multiplying night by night until the plain below was ringed with light like a second inverted sky. Hector commanded Troy's response from the first days. She watched him ride out through the Scaean Gate on the mornings of battle. His armor caught the early light in a specific way, a brightness that she noted each time with a precision she could not explain, except to say that her eyes tracked it involuntarily. He was the wall, the Trojan said. He was what stood between the city and the plain. She had seen what happened to walls. The gods did not stay distant from this war. That was a thing she had understood early, and it was a thing the years bore out with visible clarity. The divine interest was not subtle. Athena moved among the Greek lines, her grey presence bending the outcomes of single combats, nudging the course of arrows, strengthening the arm of one man while the blood left another. Apollo stood on the Trojan side, his interventions less frequent but no less decisive. He pulled Hector back from the edge of dying more than once in those middle years. He preserved the city's defenders through 100 small reversals that the Greeks could not explain. Poseidon complicated everything. His allegiances shifted with currents she could not always predict. He built the walls of Troy in a prior age, so the story said. He and Apollo together raised the stones by divine labor while Laomedon watched from his throne. Those same walls he now sometimes seemed to wish back into the earth. The sea god's resentments were old and intricate. They did not simplify even under the pressure of a 10-year war. She observed all of this from her particular position, not on the walls during battle, not in the council chamber where the men made their plans. But in the marginal spaces where information arrived before it was shaped into official report, she stood at doorways. She listened in corridors. She read the faces of the men returning through the gates before they had composed their expressions into something presentable. The gods were fighting above the battlefield, visible on clear days as disturbances in the light, shapes too large for soldiers moving at angles that armor did not permit. The Greeks felt Athena behind them. The Trojans felt Apollo. And Cassandra felt the gap between divine favor and mortal survival, and found it wider than even she had thought. Troilus was young when he died. That was what she returned to when she thought of it, which was often the specific fact of his youth. He was her brother, one of the younger ones, a boy who had grown into a young man during the siege's first years, shaped entirely by a Troy at war, knowing no other Troy. He carried the war's atmosphere in his bearing, in his quick judgment, in the ease with which he moved toward danger. She had seen it. She had seen it years before it happened, in the period when her visions were still arriving with the full force of the unexpected. She had seen him near the sanctuary of Apollo, and she had seen what Achilles was capable of. And she had understood that the particular combination of Troilus's fearlessness and Achilles's rage would produce something irreversible. She could not tell him. This was the condition. Not the inability to speak, she always spoke, but the impossibility of transmission. She said the words, and the words arrived, and they did not change anything. He rode out. He was young, and the city was besieged, and the men who could fight were riding out every season. When it happened, the grief was not softened by knowledge. She had learned this about foresight in the early years of the curse. Knowing did not prepare you. It only meant you carried the loss twice, once in anticipation and once in fact. Achilles died as well. Even the greatest of the Greeks. She had seen this too, the specific detail of it. The arrow from Paris's bow and the guidance behind it, and she had watched from the wall on the day it happened with a complex feeling that was not satisfaction and not grief, but something with no simple name. The war continued. Achilles dying did not end it. She had known this. The Greeks did not retreat in the year of his death. They pulled closer. The gods kept their arrangements. Apollo, who had loved her once in the way gods love, continued to stand with Troy even as he guided that particular arrow. She did not know what to make of this, whether it was loyalty or simply the maintenance of ancient obligations. Gods had reasons she had access to only partially, seeing the outcomes of their choices without always seeing the choices themselves. There is something specific about the 9th year. The 9th year is when a besieged city begins to change its character. Not structurally. The walls were still the walls, the temples still the temples. Priam still sat in his hall and maintained the forms of authority. But the people inside the walls had been reshaped by 9 years of this, and the city they moved through was a different city than the one Paris had sailed away from. She walked those streets. She knew what a 9th year Troy looked like. The particular quietness of the markets, the way grief had become ordinary, absorbed into the texture of each day. Hector's name spoken differently by then, not as a man's name but as a concept, a necessary structural idea. Troy's walls made flesh and given a sword arm. She walked, and she knew what the 10th year would bring. She knew because she had always known. The knowledge was not heavier in the 10th year than it had been before the ships arrived. It was simply more immediate. The gap between the seeing and the event had nearly closed. Hector's armour still caught the light on the mornings he rode out. She still watched it from the same wall, from the same position she had held since the beginning. The brightness of it was unchanged. That was the particular cruelty of the 10th year, how unchanged the ordinary things remained, even as everything moved toward its conclusion. The horse appeared on the plain on a morning when the light was wrong. She noticed the light first. Something in its quality was different from the ordinary grey gold of early morning, a flatness, an absence of the particular shimmer that rose from the plain on clear days. The air was still. The Greek cook fires, which had burned below the horizon every night for 10 years, were out. She stood on her wall and looked at the plain for a long time before she allowed herself to look at the thing standing in the middle of it. It was enormous. That was the first fact. Larger than she had expected from the vision, which had given her its proportions accurately, but had not prepared her for the way scale worked differently on an open plain, how a large thing in open space became something else. Something that reorganized the landscape around itself simply by being present in it. The horse was made of pale timber, newly cut, still carrying the brightness of fresh wood. It stood on 4 thick legs, each one planted in the earth with a stability that had nothing natural about it. The head was raised. The empty eyes faced the Scaean Gate. She had seen this. She had seen it for months. The vision had been complete, the size, the pale wood, the hollow interior, the silence around it. She had known what it contained. She had known what it was for. She stood on her wall and felt the gap between the seeing and the event close completely. Below her, the city was waking. The first voices rose from the lower streets, the first sounds of movement and ordinary morning commerce. Then the word began to travel. She could hear it moving upward through the city's levels, from the lower market to the middle streets to the corridors beneath the citadel. A wave of altered sound, the specific frequency of a city encountering something unexpected. The voices were wrong. They were not the voices of alarm. They were the voices of amazement, and something beneath the amazement that she identified after a moment as relief. The Greeks were gone. The ships were gone. The cook fires were out, and the plain was empty of soldiers, and there was only this one enormous thing standing in the morning light, with its pale wood catching the flat sun, and its empty eyes facing the gate. She heard the word wonder in the voices below her. She heard the word gift. She closed her eyes. She had known what the words would be. She had carried that too these months, not only the image of the horse, but the sound of the city responding to it. The particular quality of a population that has endured 10 years of siege and desperately needs to believe that endurance has produced an ending. She knew how badly Troy needed this to be over. She knew it because she had lived inside that need alongside everyone else, had felt it herself in its specific texture, the exhaustion of 10 years pressing toward any available conclusion. She understood the voices. She could not help them. She left the wall. She moved through the citadel's upper corridors with a pace that was controlled, deliberate, not running. Because running would be noticed and noted, and her state of mind would become the subject rather than what she needed to say. She passed 2 women from the palace household who were moving toward the outer terrace to look. She passed a young guard whose attention had already drifted to the plain. She passed a doorway where 2 of Priam's advisors stood in low, urgent conversation, their faces carrying the particular brightness of men processing something unprecedented. She went to the hall. Priam was already there. Word had reached him fast, as it always reached him, the information arriving through the palace's own channels before the official messengers had been dispatched. He was standing rather than seated, which was unusual. His posture carrying a quality she had not seen in it for years, something loosened, something that might have been the beginning of relief. The advisors and the captains were assembling. She recognized the scene from the vision, the specific arrangement of people in the hall, the quality of light from the high windows, the particular way Priam was standing. She had seen all of it. She spoke before the assembly had fully gathered. She did not wait. She had learned that waiting made no difference, that the words failed regardless of timing, but she had also learned that she could not remain silent in the face of what she knew. That silence was not an option available to her, that the words needed to leave her even knowing where they went. She said that the horse was not a gift. She said it with the directness she had learned over 10 years of speaking into the failure of transmission. She said the Greeks had not retreated. She said the horse was filled, that there were men inside it, armed men, and that bringing it through the Scaean Gate would bring those men inside the walls. She said the names of some of the men who were inside it, because she knew their names. She said what would happen in the hours after the city opened the horse and slept. The hall had gone quiet while she spoke. This was not unusual. She had learned that her speaking produced silence. Not because the words landed, but because her manner of speaking created a pause in which people waited for her to finish before returning to what they had been thinking. The silence ended. An advisor spoke of the Greeks' departure. The evidence was clear, the fire's out, the ship's gone, the plane empty. What army, he said, abandoned a 10-year siege in the night and left a gift? A votive offering to Athena, most likely, to ensure safe return. Such things were customary. The horse was a religious object. To harm it would be to risk divine anger. She said again that the horse should not enter the city. She said it plainly. She said it looking at Priam, and then at the captain standing near him, and then at the doorway where more men were arriving from the outer corridors. She said it knowing the words were dissolving as they reached each listener, becoming something adjacent to meaning, a sound with the shape of language that did not settle into understanding. Priam's face held the expression she had come to know best on his face over 10 years. Not dismissal, not contempt, but a particular gentleness that was worse than either. He was kind to her. He had always been kind to her, in the specific way that people are kind to someone whose relationship with reality they have decided is not entirely reliable. He spoke to her carefully. He said her concerns would be noted. She had heard this before. Outside the hall, she moved back toward the walls. The crowd had gathered near the Scaean Gate by then, the population of Troy pulling toward the plain's edge where the horse stood in the morning light. She could hear the crowd from the upper passage. A sound she had never heard in 10 years of siege, a crowd moving toward the gate with intention to open it rather than defend it. She went down. She had not planned to go down into the crowd, but her feet carried her there, the same feet that had carried her to the wall each morning for 10 years, following some instruction that was not entirely conscious. She came through the gate's inner passage into the press of people who were gathering along the road that led from the gate to the plain. The horse was visible from there in its full scale. Standing on the plain in the full morning light, the pale timber had taken on a warmth it had not had at dawn. The wood catching the sun across its broad flanks, the carved head with its raised profile imposing against the blue sky. It was, she admitted to herself, extraordinarily made. Whoever had built it with craft and care, the joints invisible at this distance, the proportions balanced despite its size. She said what she knew to the people near her in the crowd. She said it to the men standing closest to her, their faces turned toward the horse with that particular quality of exhausted wonder. She said the horse was hollow. She said there were Greeks inside it. The words left her and landed in the crowd and dissolved. Laocoon came from the direction of Apollo's temple. He was a priest, one of the senior priests. A man she had observed over the siege years as someone who dealt with practical necessity rather than divine devotion, competent at his role, careful in his maintenance of the temple's obligations. He was not a man she had expected to stand in agreement with her. He came through the crowd with a directness that parted people, and he stood before the horse, and he said what she had said, not in her words, not with her specific knowledge, but with his own reasoning, his own suspicion. He said the Greeks were not to be trusted. He said a gift from enemies deserved nothing but fire. He said the horse should be burned where it stood. The crowd near her shifted. She felt the shift, a kind of attention, a re-examination. The moment when a second voice creates the possibility of genuine doubt. Then the serpents came from the sea. She saw them before most of the crowd did. Two enormous shapes moving through the water at the shore's edge, then onto the beach, then across the sand with a speed that left a trail of disturbed air in their movement. The crowd saw them when they reached the plain. The crowd fell back. Laocoon was standing near the horse. She could not reach him. The crowd had reorganized around the serpent's approach, opening passages she could not control and closing others. She watched the serpents reach him. She watched what happened. The crowd that had been moving toward doubt moved away from it. The interpretation came quickly, moving through the gathered people with the ease of something that confirms what the gathering already wanted to believe. Laocoon had been punished. The gods had spoken. The horse was sacred. To harm it was to invite exactly what had happened to Laocoon and his sons. She stood in the crowd, and the interpretation moved through her as well, not because she believed it, but because she could feel its movement in the people around her. The way a current moves through water, taking everything that floats with it. She spoke again. She said what she knew. The words left her and reached no one. The gates opened wider. Ropes were brought. The horse was larger than the gate required, and there was a discussion. She could see it from her position. Men measuring the gate's dimensions against the horse's width before they began widening the opening, removing the timber of the lower arch to accommodate the horse's full passage. She watched them do this with a stillness that was not acceptance, but something past the point where a different feeling was available. The city was dismantling its own gate to bring the thing inside. The city was doing this willingly, with labor and intention, in the full light of a clear morning. She had said everything there was to say. The horse moved through the widened gate in stages, men pulling on ropes attached to its base, the enormous pale structure tilting slightly as it passed through the arch. The crowd around the gate was cheering. The sound of it was unlike anything she had heard in 10 years, not the sounds of battle or of grief or of the ordinary siege city, but something louder and more unguarded. 10 years of endurance releasing into a single moment of apparent conclusion. She stood at the edge of that sound. The horse was inside the walls. The gate closed behind it, or what remained of the gate. The widened arch stood open, the removed timber stacked to the side. Someone said it could be replaced tomorrow. Tomorrow, she thought. She looked at the horse standing in the open space inside the Scaean Gate, settled now into the packed earth on its thick legs, the pale wood warm in the afternoon light. The crowd was still gathered around it, touching the sides, looking up at the carved head, running their hands along the smooth joints. She did not touch it. She stood at the crowd's edge and looked at it and felt the specific weight of this moment, the horse inside the walls, the gate behind it, the city beginning already to prepare for celebration. One of Priam's household passed her with an armful of flowers. Garlands. For the festival that was being assembled, someone had already sent for flowers and wine, because of course they had, because this was what the city needed after 10 years, and the city was going to have it. She went back to the wall. She stood on her wall in the late afternoon and looked at the plain, which was truly empty now. The Greek encampment gone without the signs of departure she had expected. No debris, no abandoned equipment, only the impressions in the earth where the camp had been and the drag marks on the shore where the ships had launched. Clean, deliberate. An absence that had been arranged rather than accumulated. The sun descended in its specific way across the plain. The shadows of the walls stretched eastward. Apollo's temple caught the amber light in its particular hour, the stone face warming. The familiar colour she had treasured through the siege years, the ordinary, reliable fact of it. She looked at it. She let it be what it was. The city below her was preparing to celebrate. She could hear the sound of it rising through the evening, voices pitched differently than they had been pitched in years, a brightness in the collective sound that was real and was not deception. That came from genuine people genuinely feeling something they had genuinely needed to feel. She understood this. She did not resent it. She had never resented the people who could not hear her words. The curse was not their failing. The amber light faded from the temple's face. The evening came on, and with it the sounds of celebration building in the lower city. Music, she heard eventually, actual music, something that had been absent from the streets for longer than she could precisely remember. She remained on the wall until the stars appeared above the plain. The horse stood inside the gate below her. Invisible in the dark, but she knew its position, its dimensions, the exact number of men folded inside its hollow belly. She could feel them the way she felt all futures she had seen, not as imagination but as fact waiting to become event. The city was singing somewhere below. She stood on her wall in the darkness, her hands at her sides, her face turned toward the plain and the empty shore and the sea beyond, which was dark now and vast, and held no ships that anyone could see. She knew what the dark would bring. She stayed on the wall anyway, for a while longer. In the cooling air of a Troy that was still standing, listening to the sound of her city finding, in this one last night, the celebration it had wanted for 10 years. She came down from the wall when the stars were fully overhead, not because the night called her down, not because there was anything waiting for her below that she wished to find. She came down because the body requires movement eventually, and because the city was still full of sound, and because she had stood in the cooling air long enough that something in her wanted to be inside. Among walls, among the specific textures of rooms she had known since childhood, the citadel was lit throughout. Every lamp, it seemed. The hall she walked through carried the smell of wine and cooked meat, and the particular warmth of many people gathered in enclosed spaces. She passed servants moving quickly between rooms, their faces open in ways that faces had not been open in years. She passed a group of the younger children seated on a wide step, 3 of them asleep already against each other, one still awake and watching the light from an adjacent room with heavy, satisfied eyes. She stopped at the children. The one awake looked up at her. A boy, perhaps 6 years old, one of the younger ones of Priam's household, a child who had been born into the siege and had never known Troy as anything other than what it had been for the last 10 years. He looked at her the way children look at adults who arrive quietly, curious, unhurried, not yet concerned. She sat down on the step beside him. He did not say anything, neither did she. They sat together in the warm corridor while the sounds of the celebration moved through the walls around them, and the boy's eyes grew heavier, and eventually he leaned against her side, the way children lean against warm things. Without decision, simply because the warmth is there, she let him rest there. She had not often been still with anyone in recent years. The curse made proximity difficult in its way, not because people feared her, but because her presence had come to carry an atmosphere that people did not know how to sit inside for long. They were kind to her, most of them. They simply found reasons to leave. This child did not know enough yet to leave. She sat with him and listened to the sounds of the city's last celebration. And something in her chest was very quiet. Hecuba found her there. Her mother came down the corridor with a lamp in one hand and the unhurried step of a woman who had moved through this palace for 40 years and knew every shadow of it. She saw Cassandra on the step with the sleeping child, and she stopped. She did not say anything immediately. She stood and looked for a moment, and her face in the lamplight was tired and glad and complicated. She set the lamp on the floor. She sat beside Cassandra on the wide step on the other side, so that Cassandra was between her mother and the sleeping child. They sat together in the corridor. Hecuba looked at the child for a while. Then she looked at the wall ahead of her. The lamp made small movements of shadow across the stone. "I was looking for you," Hecuba said. "I thought you were still on the wall." "I came down," Cassandra said. Her mother nodded. She did not ask why. She understood, perhaps, that the answer would be something she could not reach. They were quiet together. Down the corridor, the sounds of the celebration were present, but softened by distance and stone. Someone was singing somewhere in the lower rooms, a woman's voice carrying a melody Cassandra recognized from her childhood. A song she had not heard in years, one of the ordinary songs that had been set aside without ceremony when the war began, and which had apparently been found again tonight. Hecuba heard it too. Something crossed her face. "I remember that song," she said softly. Cassandra remembered it also. She remembered her mother singing it when she and Helenus were small, in this same palace, in rooms not far from this corridor. On evenings when the world was what it had been before, Paris sailed west and brought everything back with him. She had not thought about those evenings in a long time. They had the quality of something stored away, not forgotten, but placed somewhere without a clear path back. The song moved through the walls. "Helenus," Cassandra said. Her mother turned to look at her. "Where is he tonight?" Hecuba considered this. "In the east rooms," she said. With the others." Cassandra nodded. She thought of her brother the way she often thought of him now, with a careful tenderness and with a grief that had no particular shape. They had grown up alongside each other. They had slept in the same temple as children, and woken with the same strange awareness settling into their ears like a river finding its course. But the gift had moved differently through him. Helenus had learned to carry it quietly, to speak his knowledge in ways that arrived as counsel rather than warning. And so people had listened to him in a way they had never listened to her. She did not resent this either. She had tried to once, long ago. The resentment had not held. "You were right," Hecuba said. The words landed in the corridor simply, without ceremony. Hecuba did not look at her when she said it. She kept her eyes on the wall ahead. Her voice was even, though something in the evenness cost something. "You were right about all of it," her mother said. "I have always known you were right." Cassandra looked at the sleeping child beside her. His breathing was slow and steady and entirely unconcerned. "I know," she said. "And still I could not," Hecuba said. She stopped. She tried again. "I could not make myself hold it the way you held it. Every time you spoke I heard the words as words, and then the words dissolved, and what was left was only the sound of my daughter in distress. I could only see you frightened. I could not see past the frightened daughter to the truth behind her. That is the curse," Cassandra said. "Not your failing." Her mother's hands were in her lap, very still. "It is mine also," Hecuba said, "whatever it is." They sat with that. The lamp between them made its small wavering light. Down in the city, the celebration continued. Wine was being passed. Garlands were strung somewhere near the horse. People were sleeping who had not slept easily in years. People were laughing. The music rose and settled and rose again. Hecuba reached over and took her hand. She held it the way mothers hold the hands of adult daughters, not to comfort exactly, but to make contact, to close the space that years accumulate between people who love each other and still somehow find themselves standing on opposite sides of something they cannot name. Cassandra did not pull away. She sat on the worn step of her father's palace, her mother's hand around hers, the sleeping child warm against her other side, the city's final celebration moving through the walls around them. She looked at the corridor ahead. She looked at the lamplight on the stone. She had seen this moment too, she realized. Not clearly, not in detail. But there had been something, some flash of this particular warmth, this particular corridor, this particular configuration of people on a step that she had glimpsed in an earlier vision and had not understood at the time. It had looked like grief. Then, sitting inside it, it was something else, not less sorrowful, but fuller than sorrow, a room that held sorrow as one of several things. The sleeping boy shifted slightly against her. The woman's voice in the lower rooms continued its song. The lamp cast its dependable light. Her mother did not let go of her hand. The song below continued for a while longer. Then it ended. No one in the lower room seemed to notice it had ended. The celebration carried on without the song, the way water carries on past a stone, the space where the melody had been simply filled with other sounds. Voices, laughter, the particular softness of people no longer afraid. Hecuba's hand remained around hers. Cassandra thought about what her mother had said. You were right about all of it. The words had been simple, and they had cost something, and Cassandra had received them the way she received most things now, carefully, with both hands, without pressing for more than was offered. There was a time when she would have wanted more. When the acknowledgement would have felt insufficient, a door opened too late to matter. But that time had passed. The wanting had worn smooth. What remained was something quieter, not acceptance exactly, more like recognition. The shape of a thing seen clearly without the need to argue with its edges. The sleeping child breathed against her side. His warmth was particular, distinct from the warmth of the lamp, distinct from the warmth of her mother's hand. It was the warmth of someone entirely inside sleep, someone who had released the waking world completely and gone somewhere else for the hours until morning. Cassandra had always noticed this about sleeping children, the completeness of their surrender, the way they gave themselves over to rest without negotiating. She had not slept like that in many years. She could not remember the last time she had. Hecuba shifted slightly beside her. Her weight on the step settled differently. Cassandra felt her mother's tiredness in that small movement, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had held herself upright through many years of watching her city be slowly undone. "Should you sleep?" Cassandra said. Her mother did not answer immediately. "There will be time," Hecuba said. The word time hung briefly in the corridor. Neither of them addressed it. They let it dissolve the way words dissolve when both speakers understand more is contained in them than can be safely opened. A door opened somewhere below. More sound came through, warmer and louder, the full breath of the celebration, and then the door closed again and the corridor settled back into its muffled quiet. Cassandra looked at the lamp. The flame had shortened since her mother sat down. The oil was going. It would not last through the whole of the night, this particular light. But there were other lamps elsewhere in the palace, and the city outside still had its fires, and in a few hours the sky would begin to pale in the east, regardless of what any flame did. She thought of the temple of Athena, not with intention. The thought arrived, the way certain thoughts arrived, sideways, without announcement, carrying the specific texture of a place her feet knew. The temple stood on its promontory above the lower city. She had gone there often, more often than any other place in Troy, perhaps. The goddess's statue rose at the center of the inner sanctuary, tall and cool and unchanging, the painted eyes, the raised spear, the quality of attentiveness carved into stone features that had looked out over the same altar for longer than Cassandra had been alive. She had sat at the statue's base on many mornings and said nothing, and felt, in the silence, some faint acknowledgement, not warmth. Athena did not offer warmth, but clarity. The particular clarity of a presence that did not require her to be other than she was. She had taken comfort there that she had not found elsewhere. The thought of the temple moved through her and settled. Hecuba's thumb moved slightly against the back of her hand. It was not quite a stroke. It was smaller than that. Just a faint pressure, a reminder. Here. Still here. Cassandra turned to look at her mother's profile. Hecuba was looking down the corridor. Her face in the lamplight was the face Cassandra had studied her entire life, the line of the jaw, the way her brow held its thoughts slightly inward. The careful posture of someone accustomed to being observed. She was still beautiful. The years had not taken that. They had changed it. Made it heavier, more specific, more entirely itself. Your father is sleeping, Hecuba said. Cassandra had not asked, but she understood the offering. Her mother was accounting for the household, placing everyone in the palace the way she placed objects on a table, each one where it could be found. He was tired, Hecuba said. He would not rest until the last of the feasting was done. But eventually. Cassandra nodded. She thought of Priam, her father's hands, which had always been large and which had grown more deliberate with age. The way he sat in council, not imposing himself exactly, but present, the way a mountain is present, by simple fact of being there. He had loved her. This she had never doubted. His love had not made him capable of hearing her. But it had been real, and she had felt it, and it had been one of the things that made the years bearable. She thought of Hector. She did not let herself stay there long. The sleeping child made a small sound. Not distress, only the ordinary noise of a small body rearranging itself in dreams. His head shifted against her side and then was still again. Cassandra looked at his face. 6 years old, perhaps. Born somewhere in the long middle of the siege, when the world outside the walls had already become something permanent and incomprehensible, and simply there, the way weather is simply there. He had never known Troy without the war. This city, in this state, was the only city he had any memory of. And tonight he had fallen asleep against a princess on a stone step while music floated up from below, and his face was entirely untroubled. She wanted to stay there, on that step, in that lamplight, with her mother's hand around hers, and the child warm against her other side, and the old song already finished, but still somehow present in the air of the corridor. The way a scent remains after its source has been removed. She wanted the night to be longer than it was. This wanting was not the same as the old wanting. It did not claw. It did not demand. It was softer than that. A preference held open-palmed instead of gripped. She knew what she wanted, and she knew it would not be given, and she held both of these things at once without trying to resolve them. The lamp flickered. A draught from somewhere, beneath a door, through a gap in the stone, moved the flame briefly sideways. Then it steadied. Hecuba closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Her posture did not change. But her eyes closed, and she leaned the smallest degree toward her daughter, and her hand held on. Cassandra did not move. She sat with her mother's closed eyes, and the sleeping child, and the diminishing lamp, and the distant sounds of the city's last celebration pressing softly through the walls. She sat with all of it. Outside, above the city, the sky was entirely clear. The stars were precise and numerous and very far away. They shed their faint light over the citadel, and over the plain, and over the large strange shape that stood near the walls, silent and patient in the dark, waiting in the way that only objects without minds can wait, without intention, without urgency, without any awareness at all of what they contained. Inside the corridor, the lamp burned what remained of its oil. Cassandra watched it. The lamp went out, not dramatically. The flame simply reached the end of what it had been given and became a thread of smoke, thin and pale, and then nothing. The corridor darkened around them. Cassandra felt rather than saw her mother's hand tighten briefly on hers, then relax. The dark was not complete. Light came from somewhere below, reflected from the celebration rooms, diffuse, barely enough to define shapes. The stone of the opposite wall, the curve of the sleeping child's head against her side. These things remained softly visible as the smoke from the wick dispersed and was gone. Cassandra thought, this is what it will feel like. Not the thought of someone afraid, more like the thought of someone cataloguing. A recognition placed beside its twin. The child did not wake. She let her hand rest against his back and felt the small, regular rise and fall of his breathing. His dreams, whatever they were, continued without interruption. He had slept through the lamp going out. He would sleep through whatever else the night brought for a while. Children sleep through what they are not equipped to understand, and this one had never been equipped for any other kind of world than this one, and so the world's darkening was simply darkness to him, simply that. Hecuba's eyes were still closed. Her breathing had steadied. Not sleep, but something near it, the body resting while the mind held its careful vigil. Cassandra knew her mother. She knew that Hecuba was still present, still aware of each small shift in the corridor around her, still counting, still placing. She had always been like that. Even in the earliest years Cassandra could recall, her mother had moved through the palace with a quality of absolute attention, not anxious, not urgent, but thorough, as if the act of keeping full account of a household was itself a form of love. Which it was, Cassandra understood now. Which it had always been. She had not always understood that. As a child she had wanted something louder from her mother, more expansive. But Hecuba's love expressed itself in the precise placement of hands, in the accounting, in the hand that held and did not let go. The thought of what would be taken from her was quiet. It did not announce itself. It sat beside her in the dark corridor, the way an old companion sits, simply present, expected, requiring nothing from her. Far below, someone was laughing, a long, open sound, unguarded. The sound of someone who had been drinking and had arrived at some private happiness and was not troubling to contain it. The sound rose through the stone floors and arrived in the corridor softened and strange, as if from another world, which, in a way, it was. Cassandra listened. She thought of Athena. Not the statue, the quality the statue held. That particular attentiveness. The raised spear, the painted gaze that saw everything and offered nothing except the fact of its seeing. She had sat beneath that gaze many times and understood something about it only gradually, over years. Athena did not watch in order to intervene. She watched in order to know. These were different things. Cassandra had come to understand the difference because it was also, in some sense, her own condition. She knew. She had always known. Knowing had never given her the power to stop anything. The sea would rise against them. This came to her not as a vision, but as a simple fact. The way certain things settle into certainty before they are asked to justify themselves. Athena's anger would not remain inside the temple walls. It would go outward, across the water, carried on storm winds to where the Greek ships were already making ready to depart. Poseidon would be asked. Zeus would allow it. The storms that followed would not be ordinary weather. They would be a divine account being settled, a reckoning whose terms Cassandra understood with a clarity that felt almost like detachment. Ajax would not reach his home, neither would many of the others. She did not take satisfaction in this. She had considered once or twice in her life whether she was capable of satisfaction in the suffering of those who had wronged her. And each time she had examined it carefully and found instead only a kind of exhaustion. Suffering was suffering. It did not correct what had been done. It simply added to what existed in the world. The sea rising against 1,000 ships meant 1,000 different agonies spreading in all directions. Some of those men had names she knew. Some had stood on the plain below the walls for 10 years and become, in a strange way, as familiar as neighbours. She did not wish them well. But she did not wish them storms either. What she felt was something outside of wishing entirely. A standing apart, a seeing. Hecuba made a small sound, still not sleep. Something between. Her head tilted very slightly toward her daughter's shoulder without quite arriving there. Cassandra held still. The stone step was cold through the fabric of her dress. She had stopped noticing that some time ago. The body grows accustomed to its discomforts when the mind is occupied elsewhere. She thought of Agamemnon. The name arrived without drama. She had been carrying it for weeks, the way one carries a stone that has grown familiar in the palm, the weight known, the shape known, no longer surprising. She knew what his chariot looked like approximately. She knew the arrangement of his soldiers, the banner carried at the front. She knew she would be placed among his prizes the way an object is placed, without consultation, without ceremony beyond the ceremony of ownership. She had spent some time, early in this foreknowing, attempting to feel something large about it, rage, grief, some sweeping protest at the indignity. But the large feelings had not arrived, or had arrived and passed before she could fully inhabit them. What remained was smaller, more specific. She would see the sea from the ship. She had never been on a ship, never left Troy in her life. The sea from the walls was a line of changing colour, grey and green, and sometimes a particular shade of copper in the late afternoon. From a ship, in the middle of it, it would be different. She would be surrounded by it. She tried, now, in this dark corridor, to hold that image without the knowledge of what came after it. Just the sea, just the horizon in every direction, and the smell of it, which she knew from the wind that came off the water on certain mornings. She could hold it for a moment, only for a moment. Then Mycenae was there, already present at the end of the thought. The Lion Gate. Clytemnestra standing at the top of the steps, her welcome precisely measured, her face composed into an expression that would read as warmth to those who did not know how to look at faces. Cassandra knew how to look at faces. She had always known. And after the gate, the palace. And after the palace, a room. She closed this off. The sleeping child shifted again. His hand, small and open, fell across her knee. She looked down at it. The tiny architecture of the fingers. The particular helplessness of a sleeping hand. She placed her own hand gently over it. She thought of nothing for a little while. Outside the city walls, the wooden shape stood patient and enormous on the plain, holding its cargo in perfect silence. Cassandra did not look toward the window. She knew what the darkness held. She had known for days, and the knowing had changed nothing, and it would change nothing now. She kept her hand over the child's hand. Hecuba breathed. The celebration below continued its slow unwinding toward dawn. Agamemnon. She returned to the name not because she chose to, but because it returned on its own, the way water finds a hollow in stone and settles there without being directed. She had known his name for years before Troy fell, known it the way she knew certain fixed points in the sky, not earned through attention but simply present, part of the permanent arrangement of things. She had never seen him in the early years, only the name, and around it, slowly, a shape of circumstance. The golden mask that stood in her mind when she thought of him was not something she had been given. It was something that had assembled itself from fragments. Reports that filtered into Priam's court over the long years of the war, the way certain soldiers stood differently near him than near other commanders, a posture that moved through the camp below the walls like a current under water. He was not simple. She had understood that early, Simple men did not accumulate the kind of suffering that followed Agamemnon the way shadow follows a late afternoon figure. He carried something behind him, and she had known, before she ever understood the word for it, that the thing he carried was old, much older than Troy, much older than this war, the house of Atreus. This came to her now in the dark corridor, the way it came to her often, not as a story told from outside, but as something felt from within, like a vibration in stone when a cart passes on the road above. The name of the house was a name like a wound. It had been reopened so many times that the edges no longer remembered their original shape. She knew the broad lines of it. Everyone did, in the way that certain histories become less like stories and more like weather. Tantalus first, high in his divine favour, and then lower than any man before him, punished in ways that resisted ordinary description. His crime entering the bloodline like a stain entering cloth, visible in the weave of every generation that followed. Then Pelops, his son, who won his chariot race through treachery and left an unanswered debt. Then the sons of Pelops, Atreus and Thyestes, and between them a dispute so terrible that the sun had turned backward in the sky rather than witness the resolution of it. This was what the old accounts said, and Cassandra had no reason to disbelieve them. She had seen enough of divine involvement to understand that the gods did not hold themselves apart from human cruelty. They leaned toward it sometimes, as one leans toward a fire. They observed. Atreus had invited his brother Thyestes to a feast. This was the detail that Cassandra's mind had returned to again and again over the years she had carried this knowledge. Not the act itself, which was unspeakable and could be approached only obliquely, even in thought, but the invitation, the table set in welcome, the gesture of reconciliation that concealed the opposite of reconciliation. Thyestes had eaten. His own children served to him in disguise. When he understood what had been placed before him, he overturned the table. He cursed the house. He fled. His remaining son was Aegisthus. Cassandra held this name alongside the other names she carried. Aegisthus at Mycenae, Clytemnestra in the palace, her grief for Iphigenia long calcified into something harder than grief, harder than sorrow. A resolve that did not soften and did not waver, and had been waiting 10 years for its object to return home. Agamemnon had sacrificed his own daughter at Aulis. Cassandra knew this, knew the altar on the windy shore, and the way a god's requirement can feel, to those who receive it, like the only possible shape the world will take. Iphigenia led to the altar with the understanding that she was going toward a marriage, given, instead, to a blade and a wind. Clytemnestra had been at Mycenae when news came back. There was no version of events in which a mother received this news and remained the same person afterward. 10 years she had waited, Aegisthus beside her, the son of Thyestes inside the house of Atreus. This was the shape of it. This was the mechanism of the curse fulfilling itself, generation by generation. Each act of violence producing the conditions for the next, the whole architecture of it so visible to Cassandra that she sometimes felt she could see the lines connecting each event as clearly as a mason sees the lines in a plan laid out before cutting stone. She was being carried into this. The thought arrived without sharpness. She examined it the way one examines a familiar object left on a table, present, known, not requiring new assessment. Agamemnon did not know what waited for him. This was perhaps the one area in which her situation and his converged inverted. He walked toward his own death carrying, as far as she could tell, very little genuine understanding of what Clytemnestra had become. Victory had given him certainty. Certainty narrowed the field of what a person could perceive. She felt for a moment something that was almost a sympathy for him, not warmth. Not anything that would survive examination, but a recognition that a man carrying the weight of the house of Atreus had never been free. had been pointed toward a specific ending from long before his birth by mechanisms set in motion by ancestors who had, themselves, been pointed by mechanisms older still. Olympus had watched all of it. This was the part that sat most strangely in her. The gods had watched the house of Atreus proceed through its generations of ruin and had not intervened to stop it, had, in some cases, positioned themselves to ensure it continued. Zeus setting conditions, Apollo making pronouncements, Poseidon attending to the sea. The gods were not uninterested. They were deeply interested. They watched from their distance with the focused attention of those for whom outcome is a matter of aesthetic satisfaction, not personal consequence. She was not angry at this. She had considered being angry at this. She had turned the idea over carefully many times, the way one turns a stone to see its underside. But anger required the belief that things should have been otherwise, and belief of that kind had been difficult to sustain in her particular situation for a very long time. The laughter from the rooms below had diminished, not disappeared, but thinner now, the celebration losing force as the night advanced. Hecuba had not moved. The slight tilt of her head, not quite to Cassandra's shoulder but toward it, remained fixed. Cassandra looked at her mother's profile in the near darkness, the way exhaustion could look, at this distance, like peace. She did not disturb her. The child at her side breathed in the slow rhythm of genuine sleep. His hand still lay across her knee. She had kept her own hand lightly over it. The warmth of his small fingers against her palm. She turned her attention back to what she knew. Mycenae, the curse that predated her arrival there by more generations than she could count. The table that had been overturned. The blood in the walls, as she would later stand outside the gate and say, and no one would understand what she meant, and she would know they did not understand. And she would say it anyway, because by then she would have understood something about why speaking was still necessary, even when it changed nothing. The knowing and the saying were not the same thing. She had spent years conflating them, believing that if she could only say the right words, arrange them in the right order, the knowing would transfer from inside her to inside someone else. It did not work that way. But the saying still mattered. She was not yet sure why. She was arriving at an understanding of it slowly, the way one arrives at a destination in darkness, by feel, by small adjustments, by the gradual accumulation of evidence that the ground beneath the feet is still there. Outside, the wooden horse stood on the plain. She kept her eyes forward. The cold of the stone had settled into her completely. She was no longer separate from it. The night did not deepen so much as settle. That was the word for it. Settle. The way sediment falls through water and comes to rest without drama at the bottom of a still vessel. The child shifted slightly against her side, not waking. Only the small adjustments the body makes during genuine sleep, finding a more comfortable angle, redistributing weight. His hand remained across her knee. She kept hers over it. Hecuba's breathing had changed. Slower, even. She had moved, without waking, the small distance to Cassandra's shoulder. Her weight was slight. The warmth of it, against the cold that had settled into Cassandra's bones, was noticeable in the way a single lamp is noticeable in a very dark room. Cassandra let her. The sounds below had diminished further. Not entirely gone. Occasional voices, blurred at their edges by wine and distance. The particular acoustic of stone corridors, carrying fragments and losing meaning in the same motion. She allowed herself to follow one thread of memory. Not the recent ones, not the horse on the plain, not the faces of the Trojan leaders as they listened to her with the patient expressions of people humouring someone they have long since decided not to believe. Something older, something from before the war had a shape. She had stood, once, in the corridor outside the temple of Apollo at Thymbraon. The memory had a quality of early light about it. The kind of pale gold that belongs to a specific hour of morning, not the full warmth of midday, but the suggestion of it. Helenus had been beside her. He had been describing something. A bird he had heard. The particular pattern of its call. He was good at that, in those years, the close observation of small things. He had always been more careful with the texture of the ordinary than she was. She had been inclined, even before the gift arrived in its full and unbearable form, to look past the immediate thing toward whatever it suggested, two different ways of attending to the world. Both of them, in their way, a kind of sight. She had not understood that then. The memory dissolved before it reached its ending. This was how memory functioned in her experience. It arrived with clarity at its center and grew imprecise toward its edges. The thing she retained from that particular morning was not what Helenus had said about the bird, or what she had replied, or where they had been walking to. What she retained was the light on the stone of the corridor, and the sound of his voice beside her, and the way the morning had seemed, for that particular span of moments, entirely without threat. The laughter below had stopped. She noticed the cessation without surprise. The celebration had been losing its energy for some time. The silence that replaced it was of a different quality than the silence had been earlier. Not anticipatory, used. The silence of a room when a lamp finally exhausts its oil. Hecuba stirred slightly. Not waking. A small movement of the head. Then stillness again. Cassandra observed her mother's face in what light remained. The architecture of it. The features she recognized from long familiarity, the way long familiarity makes a face readable in a way that has nothing to do with the arrangement of its features, and everything to do with what you have learned about the person wearing it. Hecuba had been a queen for a very long time. The particular quality of that long tenure had worked itself into the set of her jaw, the line of her brow. A woman who had managed the interior life of an entire city, who had borne children, buried some, sent others to war, who had dreamed, before Paris's birth, the dream of a torch, and had heard it interpreted, and had not fully believed the interpretation, and had loved her son anyway when he was born, as all parents love the living child more than the abstract danger. Cassandra did not judge this. She had spent time in earlier years not precisely judging it, but circling around something like judgment, some residue of feeling that the people who should have listened had failed in a way that carried moral weight. She had set that down too. It required a belief about what people could and could not do with knowledge they had not asked for and were not equipped to hold. And observation over time had taught her that the capacity for such holding was not a matter of will. You either received a thing or you did not. The mechanism was not under the control of the receiving person. This thought had taken her years to reach. She did not begrudge the years. The child against her side breezed on, even and deep, too young to carry the knowledge of what was outside the walls, too young to have heard the stories of the horse, or if he had heard them, too young for the stories to have settled into their true configuration. Children held information loosely. It did not anchor the way it anchored in adults. This was perhaps a mercy. She had been trying for some time to think carefully about mercy, whether it existed as a force in the architecture of what she could see, whether the gaps in the design, the places where suffering did not reach, where the mechanism of inevitability was briefly suspended, constituted something intentional or simply the natural result of complex systems having irregular edges. She had not arrived at a conclusion. The stone corridor had cooled further. She felt it through her clothing, through the skin, into the tissue beneath. Not painful, more like the process of becoming entirely still. As if the cold were doing the work of slowing her, reducing the space between her own edges and the stones. Outside, the wooden horse waited. She did not turn her eyes toward it. She held it in her awareness, the way one holds a sound, receiving it without searching for it. Present, known. Inside its belly, In the darkness that men had made inside the dark of the night, the Greeks were waiting. She had been the one to say this, had stood in the open air with the crowd around her, had used her voice clearly and without decoration. Bring the horse inside, and Troy ends. She had made it as plain as that. She had not layered it in symbol or softened it into ambiguity. She had said the thing itself. Laocoon had said it too, in his way, from a different angle. And the serpents had come from the sea, and the crowd had interpreted this as a sign that the god opposed his warning, not that the warning was urgent enough to require divine silencing. People interpreted signs according to what they wished the signs to mean. She had learned this, not as a judgment, as an observation about the relationship between desire and perception. Sinon had told his story. The crowd had listened. The gates had opened. Hecuba exhaled slowly against her shoulder. The child's fingers, small and warm, rested under her palm. The silence of the used, exhausted dark pressed in from every direction. She thought of Mycenae, of the gates there, shaped differently from Troy's, not the Scaean form she had known all her life, but the lion gate. Two stone animals carved above the lintel, facing each other across the empty space of the lintel's centre. She had seen this in the way she saw things that had not yet happened. Clear as memory, though the direction of time ran opposite, the lions watching from above. Clytemnestra below, her face composed for a greeting that was not a greeting. She would stand in the chariot outside those gates. She would speak. No one would understand. And she would speak anyway, because she had arrived, slowly, by feel, in the manner of finding one's way in darkness, at the understanding that the speaking was not for the listeners. Or not only. The saying was a form of witnessing. She said the thing so that the thing had been said, so that the true shape of events had been named aloud by someone present in the moment of their occurrence. This did not change the events. It changed something smaller. Something about whether the world had been attended to honestly in the instant before it moved on. She had no name for why this mattered. But it mattered. The corridor held its silence. The child breathed. Hecuba's slight weight rested against her shoulder. Cassandra looked at the dark window across from where she sat, and did not move, and waited for the morning she already knew was coming. The vision came without warning, not the gradual accumulation she sometimes felt, the slow gathering like weather building, but sudden. A wall opening where she had not expected a wall. She was sitting in the cold corridor with the child against her side, and Hecuba's breath warm at her shoulder. Then she was somewhere else entirely, though her body did not move. Mycenae. The palace walls. Stone older than Troy's stone, stained with something that was not water. She had seen the house of Atreus before, had touched the edges of it the way one tests the temperature of a fire from a distance. But this was full immersion. The vision drew her in completely and held her. The smell reached her first. Old blood. Not fresh, nothing sharp or immediate. This was blood that had been absorbed into the stone over generations, worked into the mortar, become part of the palace's material substance. The walls of that house held a history of violence, the way wood holds the record of its rings. You could not build on such a foundation without carrying what had been done there. She understood, fully and without the residue of surprise, what she was seeing. The children of Thyestes. Small figures, seated at a table that should have been ordinary, stone surface, the remnants of a meal. But the meal had been wrong from its inception. Atreus had fed his brother the flesh of his own sons. This was the founding crime. This was what lived in the walls. She did not look away from what the vision showed her. The children's faces were not accusatory. They were simply present, witnesses to their own story, the way she had become a witness to hers. Two small boys, their hands at rest, their eyes without anger. Just there. Inside the stone. Inside every transaction the palace had conducted since. Then Agamemnon. She saw him as she would see him in the days ahead, after the sea voyage, after the chariot through the gates. After Clytemnestra's words of welcome arranged themselves into a corridor that led only one direction, a bath and a net and a blade, and the brief animal surprise of a man who has not believed his own death possible. He was a large man. She had seen this already in the way she saw things that had not yet occurred. Broad across the shoulder, a voice that carried the certainty of someone who had commanded 10 years of war and survived. He would enter his own palace the way a man enters a space that belongs to him. He would not see what she saw. He would not feel the history in the walls. Most people did not feel the history in the walls. The cold of the corridor came back to her. She felt it along her spine, felt the child's warmth against her side. Hecuba's slight weight, the stone beneath her. She was still here, still in Troy's corridor. The night still all around her, close and finished in its darkness. The vision had not taken her body anywhere. It had merely taken her attention and returned it. She breathed. Once, twice. The face of one of Thyestes' sons stayed with her for a moment after the vision cleared, a child's face, serious in the way children are serious when they are holding something they do not fully understand. It occurred to her that she had worn that same expression once. Standing in Apollo's temple, the serpents quiet around her ankles, the world suddenly strange and wide and full of information that had no form yet for her to name, she had been that young. That serious, that unaware of what the gift would require. Her own death was also there in the vision's residue, not new, she had known its outline for some time. But the knowing did not simplify it. Clytemnestra's blade would not distinguish between the king and the woman brought in his chariot. The logic of the house of Atreus consumed indiscriminately. You could walk into it clearly seeing its nature and still be consumed. The seeing did not constitute exemption. She had understood this for long enough that it had lost its particular sting. What remained was something more like heaviness, not fear, not even grief in its acute form, a heaviness that pressed evenly across everything, across the vision of the children in the walls, across her own still unoccurred death. Across the corridor where she sat, across the wooden horse outside and the Greeks inside it, all of it pressing with the same quiet, undiscriminating weight. This was what people did not understand when they looked at her and called her cursed. They assumed the curse was the disbelief, the isolation of the unheard prophet. But the curse lived lower than that, in the evenness of the heaviness, in the fact that nothing could be surprising when you already held all the information. Surprise was a relief that had been withheld from her since childhood. She shifted, very slightly. Against the wall, the child stirred but did not wake. Small sounds, a breath held and then released, the brief tightening of the small fingers against her knee. Then the child's breathing resumed its regular depth. Hecuba's weight remained unchanged against her shoulder. Her mother slept with a completeness that Cassandra found in this moment something she could only call grateful to witness. That this woman who had built her whole life inside Troy's walls, who had borne children into those walls, who had outlived some and would outlive more, could still find sleep on this particular night, could still let consciousness go and trust the dark. Cassandra had not been able to do that for many years. She looked at the dark window across from her, a square of lesser darkness, the sky beyond it, just barely different from the stone around it. The horse stood in that direction. She did not need to see it. Inside the palace, somewhere deeper in the stone, water moved through a channel built long before she was born. She could hear it if she held her attention very still. A low, continuous sound beneath the silence. Troy's infrastructure carrying on. The engineering of the city still performing its function even on this last night. She listened to the water for a moment. Then the vision returned, not the full immersion of before. Just a fragment, a single image. Her own mouth open, her voice leaving her body in words she already knew she would speak outside the palace at Mycenae. Not words of warning any more, the time for warning would have passed by then. These would be words of naming, of saying what was already in motion with full accuracy one final time, because the thing deserved to be named even when naming could do nothing. She would stand in the bright Greek sunlight, in a place she had never wanted to go, and she would speak. The image dissolved. The corridor received her back. Outside, the city held its last silence. The wooden horse crouched in the dark. The child breathed against her side with the deep trust of someone who did not know what trust was costing the person beside them. Cassandra did not move, did not close her eyes, sat in the corridor between all the things she knew, and let the knowledge rest. The water moved beneath the floor. She kept her attention on that sound. It asked nothing of her. It made no claim. The channel carried its water in the dark exactly as it had on every other night of her life, not knowing this night was different from any other, not knowing there was any difference to know. She found that she did not resent it. The child made a small sound and settled deeper into sleep. The small fingers had released their grip on her knee. Cassandra looked at them in the dim light. Soft, unmarked. A child's hand that had not yet been asked to hold anything heavy. She let her gaze rest there for a moment, then let it move away. There was a quality to this hour that she recognized. Late enough that the palace had given up all pretense of wakefulness. Early enough that the dark still held. The narrow time in which silence had fully arrived and not yet begun to think about leaving. Helenus had loved this hour once. He had told her so when they were very small, sitting on the steps outside their room in Priam's palace, stone steps worn smooth by years of feet. He had said he liked the way the world felt finished in the late dark, contained, like a room with all its doors shut. She had not understood it then. She had wanted doors open. She understood it better now. Helenus had gone his own way with his gift, the quieter way. He read patterns in the movements of birds, in the arrangement of smoke, in the fall of water from a cup tilted at a certain angle. He spoke his knowledge carefully and seldom, wrapping each prophecy in enough ambiguity that people could hear it without flinching. He had found the way to carry the gift that did not break him against other people's refusal to receive it. She had never learned that way. She spoke plainly because she could not see the point of anything else. Apollo had not asked her to learn to speak gently. He had given her the gift complete and whole, and then when she refused him, he had taken from her only the ability to be believed. He had not taken the clarity. He had not muted the precision. Perhaps that was deliberate. Perhaps it was not. She had stopped trying to read intention into the gods' choices some years ago. The gift was what it was. The curse was what it was. She was what she was inside both of them. Her back held the faint cold of the stone wall. She felt it now more than she had earlier. The night had deepened past its midpoint, and the palace stone held a different cold at this hour. Closer, more insistent. She did not adjust her position. Hecuba's weight against her shoulder was balanced, and she would not disturb that balance for her own comfort. Her mother's breathing, slow, even, the sound of someone completely elsewhere. Cassandra had wondered sometimes what it was like to inhabit sleep so fully, not just to slip into unconsciousness, but to actually go somewhere, to be absent from the waking world in a way that felt like arrival somewhere else. She had her visions, which took her attention and returned it. But that was not the same. She was always present in her body, always located in the specific cold of this specific corridor, or the specific noise of whatever room she occupied. The visions moved through her. They did not carry her away. She thought about what the gift had felt like in the first moments. Apollo's temple at Thymbraon. The air in that place had always seemed thicker than ordinary air, heavier with meaning. She and Helenus had gone there as children many times, and the serpents that lived in the temple had never frightened them. The snakes moved slowly in the warm part of the day and coiled near the base of the altar in the cool hours. They had accepted the children's presence with a kind of ancient indifference. On the morning when the gift arrived, she had not felt it coming. That was the detail she always returned to when she tried to understand the shape of what had happened to her. There had been no warning. No premonitory trembling in the air, no sense of threshold. One moment she was a child sitting on a stone floor with serpents moving quietly past her feet. Then the world opened, not dramatically. There was no light, no voice. The opening was more like the moment when your eyes adjust to a dark room and objects that were invisible resolve into their actual forms. The serpents had not done anything visible. They had simply passed near her, and the gift had been there. The world became full of information. That was the only way she had ever found to describe it. The world became full of information that it had previously kept from her, and the fullness was so complete and arrived so fast that she had sat very still for a long time, holding it, wearing the same expression she had seen on the face of one of Thyestes' sons in her vision.
Serious.
Concentrated. A person trying to hold something too large in too small a space without spilling it. She had been trying to hold it without spilling it ever since. The water continued beneath the floor. The child breathed against her side. There was Hector's voice somewhere in her memory. Not his words. She had stopped cataloguing the specific words people had spoken to her long ago. But the texture of his voice was there, low and measured. The voice of someone who believed that being reasonable was a form of courage. He had not believed her. None of them had, but he had never looked at her with contempt. That distinction had mattered more than she had admitted to anyone. She had watched him from Troy's walls. She had known before it happened what the outcome would be. She had stood at the wall on the day he died and known, and still she had stood there watching, because there was nothing else to do with knowing except witness it. Being right had never felt like winning. It had always felt like this, the heaviness pressing evenly over everything. The dark window across the corridor held its faint square of lesser dark, no change in it. The sky was still deep, still undifferentiated from stone. She thought about Helenus on those steps outside their room. The pleasure he had taken in doors shut and the world feeling finished. She had wanted open doors then. She had wanted the world to keep arriving. She understood him now. She held that understanding quietly, like something found late that could not be returned to the person it should have been given to earlier. The water moved. The child's breath measured itself against the silence. Hecuba slept. Cassandra sat inside everything she knew and did not find it necessary to name any of it aloud. The night held its position, not moving toward dawn, not retreating from it. Simply present, as stone is present, as water is present, without requiring anything from her in return. She let her hands rest open in her lap, two hands that had gestured toward so many things no one would look at, that had pointed at the horse on the day it arrived outside the gates, that had touched these walls, Troy's walls. Her whole life pressing palms flat against the stone as though the walls might eventually press something back. They were still now. There was nothing left to point at, nothing left to warn toward. The last night had come, exactly as she had always known it would, and her hands could rest. The water beneath the stone floor moved in its slow, constant way. She had been listening to it for hours now. Not attending to it exactly, more the way you might be aware of your own breathing without thinking about it. The sound had become part of the silence rather than a break in it. She thought about Troy as it had been before the war. Not the war years, not the smoke, not the watching from the walls. She thought about the city in the ordinary time, the time before Paris had sailed west and come back with everything that followed, Priam's court in the long afternoon light. the smell of the sea coming over the walls from the northwest when the wind turned, the sound of the market beneath the citadel, voices layering over each other in that particular way that sounded like water itself. Like the sea, the city was built to face. She had been a child in those rooms. She had walked those corridors before she knew what waited at the end of them. Hecuba shifted slightly in her sleep, settling deeper against Cassandra's shoulder. The movement was slow, unconscious, the body finding its own comfort without waking. Cassandra did not move. She absorbed the slight redistribution of weight and held herself still. She thought about Priam's voice. His voice had been different from Hector's. Where Hector's voice was measured, considered, Priam's had the quality of someone who had spoken in large rooms for so long that he no longer distinguished between public address and private conversation. Even in quiet moments he had a slight projection to his voice, as though he was always addressing more than the room, as though he assumed the gods were listening and wanted them to hear something worth attending to. She had loved that about him. She had not known she loved it until now, sitting in the dark corridor with the palace around her and the water beneath her and her father somewhere in the rooms behind her sleeping. Not knowing what the morning would bring, not knowing in the way she knew it. Whatever peace he had in sleep, she was glad of it. She had been right about so many things. And gladness at his peace was the only thing she could offer him now. The child's small fingers pressed lightly against her knee. Not grasping, simply present there the casual trust of a sleeping child who had found a body to rest against and had stayed. She looked down at the fingers in the dim light. They were very small. She could see only their outline. She thought about the sea. From the highest point of Troy's walls, on clear days, the water was visible in both directions. The wide dark of the Hellespont to the northeast, and the longer glitter of the Aegean to the west. She had stood at that height many times. She had stood there knowing what was coming across the water, watching the horizon for the shapes that were not yet visible, but that she already carried in her with perfect clarity. The Greek ships had appeared on the horizon exactly as she had seen them. The same morning light, the same angle of approach, the same number. Nothing had surprised her except how ordinary it felt. How the world simply continued to arrange itself according to what she already knew. She had expected knowing to feel like power. She had expected it to feel like something. Instead, it had felt like this. Like watching a stone fall, that you dropped yourself, except that you had not dropped it. You had simply been shown the ground. The night held still around her. No sounds from outside. The Greeks in their camps, she knew. She knew that too without attending to it. The information was simply there, pressed against the back of her awareness like the cold of the wall pressed against her back. Present. Factual, requiring nothing from her. She let her thoughts move to Hector, not to his death, not to the specific unbearable morning on the plain. She let them move instead to an earlier time, the courtyard below their rooms in a summer morning before the Greeks had come. He had been doing something ordinary, inspecting a harness or a piece of armor, she could not remember which. The light had fallen across his hands. He had looked up and noticed her watching and had smiled. A brief, easy smile. The smile of someone who expected the morning to continue. She had known even then. She had carried his death alongside that smile for years. She did not feel angry about it any more. She had felt angry for a long time. The anger had been its own kind of company, but the anger had worn itself out somewhere in the long middle years, and what remained was something quieter. Something that did not have a name. Not acceptance. Not peace either. More like the state you reach when you have held a difficult thing long enough that the holding becomes unremarkable. She had held it long enough. The dark window across the corridor remained unchanged. No lightning in it. Still the deep flat dark of the hours between midnight and the first pale signal of dawn. She had been watching it without meaning to, with some part of her attention that checked in and reported back, still dark. still the same square of nothing, still the night maintaining itself. She thought about the smell of the sea on those northwestern winds, salt and distance, and the cold out past the headlands. She thought about the market sounds, the layered voices. She thought about the way the stone of the palace walls held warmth in the evening after a hot day. How you could press your hand flat against the stone an hour after sunset and still feel the stored heat releasing slowly back into the air. She had done that as a child. She remembered the warmth of it. Her hands were open in her lap. She did not raise them. She simply remembered what the warm stone had felt like under her palms. The specific texture of it, the slow release of stored heat. Troy, giving back what the sun had given it, in the dark, quietly, with no one needing to watch. The water moved beneath the floor. Hecuba breathed against her shoulder, slow and even. Whatever Hecuba dreamed, she was not dreaming of tomorrow. Cassandra hoped she was dreaming of something ordinary. A morning in the market, a conversation in the courtyard. Something from the long years before any of it had begun. The child breathed against her side. The small fingers on her knee did not move. Cassandra sat in the corridor of the palace she had been born in on the last night of its standing, and held the weight of everything she had ever known without putting any of it down. The air in the corridor was cool and still. No wind reached this far inside. The smells were stone and dust and the faint sweetness of the child's hair. She had been right about all of it. Troy's walls, the war's end, the fire that was already waiting somewhere in the dark outside the gates. She had been right, and no one had listened. And now it made no difference whether anyone had listened or not, because the morning would arrive regardless. She thought of her father's voice in the large rooms, aimed at the gods. Expecting them to be listening, she thought perhaps they were. She thought, it does not change anything, but perhaps they were. The water moved beneath the stone, patient and indifferent and continuous. Tracing its path through the dark foundations of the city, carrying on. The water moved. She listened to it without trying to hear it. The way it pressed up through the stone, steady and low, the sound of a thing that had never stopped and would not stop. Not tonight. Not when the gates opened. Not in the years that came after, when Troy was only a name pressed into other people's mouths. She knew those years too. Incompletely, in the way a lamp lights only what it touches and leaves the rest in shadow. But she knew enough. A man named Aeneas would leave before the city fell entirely. She had seen his figure in her visions many times, moving westward, carrying something in his arms, something he had gathered from the fire. The gods had arranged that much, whatever else they had allowed. Troy would not end entirely. It would become something else, transformed rather than extinguished. She found that she did not resent it. There had been a time when she might have. But she sat in the corridor of the palace where she had been born, and Hecuba breathed against her shoulder, and the child's fingers rested unmoving on her knee, and the resentment had nothing left to attach itself to. The dark window held its shape across the corridor, a square of nothing. She had looked at it enough times tonight that it had become familiar, a fixed point. She let her eyes rest there without expecting anything from it. Her own death she had seen clearly. She had seen it many times, from many angles, the way you return to a thought you cannot leave alone, not because you want to, but because it keeps arriving, Mycenae. A palace larger than this one, in some respects, and in other respects much smaller. Clytemnestra waiting in the interior with the long patience of someone who had planned a thing so thoroughly it had become almost abstract. Agamemnon walking inside ahead of her, not knowing. She had watched it in her visions with a kind of removed attention, as you watch a thing that is true and therefore requires only witnessing. After her would come Orestes. She knew this also. The son returning to his mother's house to answer a death with a death. And then something else, some adjustment, some slower justice grinding forward across the years. She could not see the end of that line. The visions blurred eventually into what felt like fog, and she had learned not to reach into it. It was sufficient to know what she knew. She thought of Helenus, her brother, who had received the same gift through different hands. The serpents in the temple that night, the cool stone of the floor, the sound of breathing. She had woken beside him and seen in his face that he had been changed in the same direction she had. They had not spoken of it that first morning. They had simply looked at each other in the way of people who have seen the same country and know that words will reduce it. He had taken his gift quietly, turned it inward, kept it measured. He was still alive somewhere in the dark out past the walls. She knew that too. One of the things she knew that did not cause her pain. He would survive this. The line would continue. The gift would go on in him, quiet and practical and unflamboyant. She had always been the louder one. Hecuba shifted slightly. Her breathing changed rhythm, then settled. She did not wake. Cassandra kept still. She thought of Apollo. Not with hatred and not with longing, simply as a fact of her history, like the city she had been born in, or the war that had eaten its way through 10 years outside its walls. He had offered and she had refused, and he had answered her refusal with the one cruelty available to him. She had made him small by declining what he thought was a gift. He had made her smaller still by removing what a gift requires. An audience, a listener, a single voice that might say, yes. Yes, I believe you. She had spent so long without that voice that she had stopped reaching for it. The light in the window did not change, but there was something different. A quality to the darkness outside that window that had not been there before, not yet dawn. Still the deep hours, yet the dark was no longer the same dark. Something had shifted in it, imperceptibly, the way water shifts its temperature before any surface sign appears. She knew what it meant. She had known she would be sitting here when it happened. Morning was still a long time away in any ordinary measure. But it was no longer impossible. It was now only distant. She looked at Hecuba's face, smoothed by sleep into something earlier. Something from before Hector, before Paris, before the whole long unravelling. Her mother's face as it might have looked in the years before Cassandra was born. When Priam was a king whose city had not yet been asked to pay for its pride, she looked at the child against her side. The small fingers still, the breath rising and falling with that absolute unconscious regularity that only the very young can manage. The child did not know what was coming. She would not explain it. There was no point in explaining it, and there never had been. She had spoken her whole life into a silence that absorbed everything she said and gave nothing back. At Mycenae she had stood in the chariot outside the palace gates and spoken plainly, the words she had carried across the Aegean still exact and clear. She had named Agamemnon's death, named her own, spoken the smell of blood in the walls of the house of Atreus, the old murdered children of Thyestes. The curse that had wound itself through that family for generations before either of them had arrived to receive its latest work. The citizens had listened with the same expression people always wore. Patient, slightly puzzled, waiting for her to finish. She had finished. She had walked inside. She had been right about all of it. The voices she had spoken her visions into across those years, all the rooms and corridors and high walls and windy gates, all of them had carried something forward, whether they knew it or not. Words enter the air, and the air does not simply empty. Something remains. Changes hands in the changing. Orestes would come, and he would act, and the justice that gathered itself slowly around the house of Atreus would move in part because she had named the shape of it out loud. She had not been silent. The water moved in the foundations of Troy. If you made it to the end, take a moment to like and subscribe if these stories have become part of your nights, and let me know in the comments that you stayed. It always means something to know who was here. The dark window held its shape. The child's fingers rested on her knee. Hecuba breathed beside her. And Cassandra sat in the corridor of her father's house, her hands open and still. The whole known weight of everything distributed quietly across her, the pale suggestion of light at the far rim of the world not yet visible but already decided.